The first snow of November came sideways that year, riding a wind that tore down from the Cumberland Plateau with a fury that felt personal. Ruth McAllister had lived on this mountain for 11 years, and she knew the difference between a storm that wanted to inconvenience you and a storm that wanted to kill you. This one wanted to kill you. She had stoked the wood stove to a hard amber roar before supper time, stacking 3 extra cords of split hickory against the inside wall where the heat could chase the moisture out. The windows were sealed with heavy wool blankets she had sewn herself, their edges tucked into the frames so no thread of cold could work its way through. The kerosene lamps threw warm gold circles against the chinked log walls, and the smell of pine resin and wood smoke filled the cabin with something that was almost peace. Almost. Ruth sat in her husband's rocking chair. She still thought of it as Earl's, always would, with a dog-eared copy of a Louis L'Amour novel open across her knees, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. The novel was good, the kind of Western that Earl had always mocked her for loving, all gunfighters and honor and dusty justice. He'd mock her and then steal the book when she set it down. She kept this one on the nightstand still, his bookmark still wedged somewhere in the middle, a folded gas station receipt from 9 years ago. She turned the page without reading it. Outside, the storm hammered the mountain. Jasper raised his head from the braided rug near the stove. He was a golden retriever, 7 years old, missing his right rear leg from a tangle with a steel trap he'd wandered into 3 winters back. She had carried him 4 miles down the mountain road to the veterinarian in Coalfield, holding his bleeding leg wrapped in her flannel shirt the entire way, and she had not cried once during the drive. She had cried in the parking lot after the vet told her he would live. Just once, hard and fast, and then she had put it away, the way she had always put things away. Jasper was the best dog she had ever known, not because he was clever or obedient or particularly handsome, though she thought he was magnificent, but because he understood her silences without trying to fill them. Now he raised his head and fixed his dark eyes on the front door, and the sound that came from his chest was not his usual half-hearted grumble at a passing deer. It came from somewhere low and serious, the kind of sound that moved the hair on the back of Ruth's neck. She folded the corner of her page, set the book on the side table. In 31 years as an emergency room nurse at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, and 4 years before that as a field medic attached to a mobile Army surgical hospital during the worst stretch of the Korean War, Ruth McAllister had learned to trust the moment when her body changed registers. When the peripheral noise dropped away and the focus narrowed to a single bright point, she felt it now. That old, cold clarification spreading through her chest like a poured glass of water. She was 74 years old. She lived 14 miles from the nearest neighbor on a rutted fire road that the county had stopped maintaining 6 years ago. There was no cell signal at the cabin. The landline had been cut by falling timber twice already this winter, and the phone company had stopped making emergency repairs out here after Earl died, and there was no one left to complain to the county commissioner. She was alone on a mountain in a killing storm, and Jasper was growling at the door. Ruth stood up, her knees aching with the cold the way they always did now, and crossed the cabin to the tall oak cabinet near the kitchen door. She opened it without looking, her hand finding the grip of the Colt Python Point .357 Magnum by memory alone. Earl had given it to her the year they moved up here, pressing it into her hands with that expression he got when he was serious. Brow furrowed, eyes soft, the look that meant he wasn't going to argue with her, but he needed her to hear him. "You know how to use this," he had said. "I know you do. Just promise me you won't ever be too proud to pick it up." She checked the cylinder, 6 rounds full. She closed it with a soft click and held the weapon loosely at her side. The knock, when it came, was not a knock at all. It was a body striking the door. A full, desperate collision of flesh and wood that rattled the hinges in their mortises and sent Jasper scrambling to his 3 feet, barking with a fear she had never heard from him before. Then a voice. A woman's voice, thin as paper, torn by the wind. Ruth crossed the room in 4 strides and threw back the deadbolt. The door burst inward with the storm, bringing a wall of freezing air and snow and the smell of copper and wet leather, and with it a woman who was already falling. Ruth caught her under the arms by pure reflex, the python transferring to her left hand as her right hooked around the woman's rib cage. The woman was heavy, heavier than she looked, and Ruth understood why immediately. She was pregnant, visibly, substantially, unmistakably pregnant, her belly straining against a white maternity shirt soaked black with blood. Ruth kicked the door shut against the gale with the heel of her boot and lowered the woman to the floor, one hand already pressing against the wound before she had fully processed where it was. High chest, right side, just below the collarbone. The blood was dark and fast, and the entry wound had the scorched, stippled look of a contact shot. Someone had put a gun barrel against this woman's body and pulled the trigger. "Stay still," Ruth said. Not gently, firmly. The tone that meant she was working and needed compliance. "Please." The woman's voice was barely sound at all. Her eyes were blue and very wide and full of a terror that Ruth recognized from the field hospitals in Korea. That particular animal panic of someone who has been badly hurt and does not know whether they are going to survive the next hour. "My baby. Is my baby?" "I need you to stop talking and let me work." Ruth had already peeled back the woman's shirt, pressing a folded dish towel from her apron pocket hard against the wound. "What's your name?" "Grace." A pause, a wet cough that made Ruth's jaw tighten. "Grace Donovan." "I'm Ruth. You're inside now. The bleeding is going to stop." She looked at Grace's face. Mid to late 20s, blonde hair plastered to pale skin, a small tattoo of a bird in flight on her collarbone just above the wound. Beautiful girl. Somebody's daughter. Somebody's wife, judging by the wedding band on her left hand. "Who did this to you?" "Black SUV, two of them. They ran me off Route 27, up near the state forest boundary." Grace's eyes slipped sideways and Ruth tapped her cheek sharply once. "They shot through the window before the car went over. I got out. I climbed the embankment. I saw your light through the trees." "How far did you walk?" "I don't—" Another cough, worse this time. "Half a mile, maybe more." "Half a mile through November mountain snow with a gunshot wound and a 7-month belly." Ruth filed that away in the compartment where she kept things that earned her respect and moved on. "Jasper, back!" The dog retreated obediently, circling to his rug, watching with worried eyes. Ruth rose to her feet and went to the canvas trauma bag she kept on the high shelf above the kitchen counter. A habit from the hospital years, always knowing where the bag was, always keeping it stocked. She had restocked it 6 weeks ago with fresh sterile dressings, a set of surgical clamps, suture materials, a blood pressure cuff, and an IV kit with 2 bags of normal saline. She had restocked it out of habit, the way she still made 2 cups of coffee every morning out of habit, the second one sitting untouched on the counter until she noticed it and poured it down the sink. She knelt back beside Grace, working quickly and without wasted motion. Sterile dressing sealed over the entry wound, heavy compression bandage wrapped under the arm and over the shoulder secured with medical tape. She checked Grace's back. Exit wound, cleaner, slightly lower, which was fortunate because it meant the subclavian artery was intact. The lung was the concern. She pressed her ear to Grace's back and listened to the breath sounds on both sides. Right lung was diminished. Not collapsed, not yet, but compromised. She needed to watch it. "I need to move you," Ruth said. "Can you help me, or do you need me to carry you?" "I can help." Grace proved it. She gritted her teeth and got her feet under her with Ruth's arm around her waist, and together they crossed the cabin to the kitchen table, which Ruth had already cleared with one sweep of her forearm, sending a stack of mail and a coffee mug to the floor. She got Grace onto the table and checked her blood pressure with the cuff. Low. Not catastrophically low, not yet, but moving in the wrong direction. "I'm going to start an IV line," Ruth said. "I know it looks alarming. It's going to help." "You're a nurse?" "Was." Ruth found the vein in Grace's left arm on the first try, something that had taken her 3 years to be able to do consistently under pressure, and that she had never lost. She taped the line, connected the saline bag, and hung it from the cabinet door handle above the table. 31 years at Vanderbilt. Before that, Korea. Grace stared at the ceiling, breathing carefully. After a moment, she said, "I pressed the SOS button on my beacon. Before the car went over. I don't know if it went through with the storm." "Who gets the signal?" A pause. "Wade." "Your husband?" Another pause, longer. "Yes." Ruth began cutting away the leather jacket that had been draped over Grace's shoulders, trying to get a better look at the wound and the compression bandage. The jacket was heavy, a man's jacket, several sizes too large for her. As Ruth peeled it free, she turned it over to check the lining. A clinical habit, checking the patient's belongings for medications, identification, anything useful. She saw the patch. It was sewn into the center of the back panel in careful, precise stitching. A skull wreathed in flame, wings spreading to either side. The image both crude and somehow exact. The kind of emblem that had been refined over decades of repetition until every line carried weight. Above it, an arc of white letters on black. Iron Serpents. Below it, Tennessee. And on the left breast panel, smaller, a diamond-shaped patch in red and white that Ruth had never seen up close but knew by reputation. The one percenter patch that certain motorcycle clubs wore to announce that they operated outside the law and were proud of it. And below that, a rectangular patch that spelled it out completely. Property of Wade Donovan, President. Ruth set the jacket down on the kitchen chair with great care, the way you set down something that might be alive. She knew the Iron Serpents. Everybody in eastern Tennessee who had been paying attention for the last 15 years knew the Iron Serpents. They had started as a roughneck riding club out of Knoxville in the 90s, mechanics and truck drivers and veterans who liked motorcycles and strong whiskey and being left alone. Over 2 decades, they had grown into something considerably more complicated than that. The newspapers called them an outlaw motorcycle organization. Law enforcement called them a criminal enterprise. The men who wore the patch called themselves brothers. And the distinction between those 3 descriptions was something the courts had been arguing about for years without resolution. What Ruth knew specifically about Wade Donovan was this. He had built the Tennessee chapter from 40 men to over 200 in 8 years. He had driven 2 rival organizations out of the Cumberland region through methods that had never been charged but were widely understood. He had been arrested 6 times and convicted of nothing. And he commanded the loyalty of his men with an absoluteness that the newspapers, when they covered the club, described as either admirable or terrifying, depending on the writer's disposition. His wife was bleeding on Ruth's kitchen table. Ruth looked at Grace, really looked at her, the way she had learned to look at patients in the first year of nursing. That complete inventory that took in everything at once before the rational mind could start editing. Young woman, frightened, in pain, carrying a child, wearing her husband's jacket over her own clothes like a coat of armor that hadn't worked. She had walked half a mile through snow and darkness with a bullet in her shoulder because she had seen a light in the trees and chosen to trust it. That told Ruth something. Not about Wade Donovan or the Iron Serpents, about Grace. "How far along are you?" Ruth asked. 34 weeks. Grace's eyes found Ruth's face. "It's too early, isn't it? If something happens..." 34 weeks is premature, but it's not catastrophic, Ruth said. Babies born at 34 weeks do well most of the time with proper care. She did not say, "We are not in a hospital and we do not have proper care." She said, "I need you to tell me if anything changes in how your body feels. Any new pain, any pressure, anything different than right now." "Okay." Grace's hand moved to her belly, pressing against it through the maternity shirt. A check, automatic and maternal. The way new mothers-to-be touch their middles constantly, reassuring themselves. Okay. Ruth had covered the windows and banked the fire higher. She pulled her heavy winter coat from the hook by the door and checked the python cylinder again, then went to the cabinet and retrieved the second weapon she kept there. A Remington 8.70 pump shotgun, loaded with buckshot, the one she kept for the occasional black bear that wandered down from the high ridges in early spring. She set it on the counter where she could reach it without crossing the room. She sat down in the chair beside the table and watched Grace's breathing and watched the windows and listened to the storm. It was 9 minutes before Jasper raised his head again. This time he did not growl. He went perfectly still, the way prey animals went still. Absolute cessation of all non-essential movement, all energy redirected to the ears and the nose. It was a stillness more alarming than any sound he could have made. Ruth was at the window in 3 steps, peeling back one edge of the wool blanket by a single careful inch. Through the driving snow, 2 headlights moved slowly up the fire road toward the cabin. Not quickly. Slowly, the way a vehicle moves when the driver is watching carefully and does not want to announce himself prematurely. The headlights were widely spaced and high off the ground, the profile of a large SUV. black as far as she could tell in the darkness. Ruth thought about the python in her hand. She thought about Grace on the table and the IV line and the sailing bag. She thought about what she was going to do in the next 4 minutes. She put on her coat. She tucked the python into the deep right pocket of it, accessible but concealed. She pulled on her wool cap and her boots, moving quickly and without sound, and she went to the table. "There's a vehicle coming up the road," she said quietly, her voice level. "It may be your husband's people. It may not be. Either way, I need you to stay exactly where you are, stay quiet, and under no circumstances come to the door or make a sound unless I tell you to. Do you understand me?" Grace's eyes had gone wide again. "Ruth, do you understand me?" "Yes." Ruth crossed to Jasper, gave the dog's ear a single firm pat, pointed to his rug. He went. She unbolted the front door and stepped out onto the covered porch, pulling the door shut behind her. The cold hit her like a flat board. 14 degrees, she estimated, maybe colder with the wind. The snow was coming horizontally now, driving needles of ice against her face. She planted her boots shoulder-width apart on the porch planks and let her face go slack. Let her spine curve slightly, let the years show. She was 74 years old. She knew how to look like a harmless old woman when she needed to. She had done it before in other circumstances, for other reasons. The trick was to mean it just enough that your body believed it, while keeping a different kind of readiness somewhere underneath. The SUV stopped 30 feet from the porch steps. Its engine idled. For a long moment, nobody got out. Then both doors opened simultaneously. Two men, dark raincoats, not warm enough for this weather, which meant they hadn't planned to be out in it long. One carried a high-powered tactical flashlight, the beam swinging immediately to Ruth's face. The other had his right hand in his coat, and she could see the butt of a suppressor extending 2 inches below the hem of the fabric. Ruth squinted into the light. She raised one hand to shield her eyes, a gesture of confusion and frailty. "Lord Almighty," she said, pitching her voice into the register of a startled old woman. "Who's out there? Is that you, Doyle? Doyle, is that the propane truck?" "Ma'am." The man with the flashlight kept the beam in her face. "Sorry to bother you. We had an accident down the road a ways. Woman in a car went off the embankment, blonde, pregnant. We've been looking for her. You see or hear anything unusual in the last hour or so?" "A woman?" Ruth cupped her hand to her ear, squinting through the light. "I haven't seen a soul since Tuesday. I don't get many visitors up here. You boys need to call the sheriff. There's a phone in Coalfield." "We checked the road," the second man said. He was closer than his partner now, drifting to Ruth's left with the quiet intentionality of someone trained to outflank. "Tracks in the snow lead up this way. Looks like somebody was walking and not walking well." The flashlight dropped from Ruth's face and swung to the porch boards near her feet. Ruth did not look down. She kept her eyes on the man with the suppressor. The flashlight beam settled on something near the doorframe, a smear of darkness against the pale wood, imperfectly washed by the blowing snow. "What's that on your porch, ma'am?" Ruth glanced at it as if for the first time. "Deer," she said. "I gutted a small buck yesterday morning. Always drips a little when I bring the quarters through." The armed man had climbed the first porch step. Not all the way up, but testing it, measuring the distance. Ruth's hand moved into her coat pocket. Her fingers closed around the python's grip. She felt the familiar weight of it, the exact geometry of the cylinder and the hammer and the trigger guard that her hand had memorized over 11 years of handling. She did not draw it. Not yet. "Mind if we take a quick look inside?" the flashlight man asked. His tone had shifted. The friendly concern had evaporated, and what remained was something flat and transactional. "Just to be sure." "I do mind," Ruth said. She drew the python in a single smooth motion and leveled it at the armed man's chest. The hammer was back. The barrel was perfectly steady. She did not extend her arm in the television drama pose that people who had never fired a weapon under pressure thought looked authoritative. She held it close to her body, elbow slightly bent, the geometry of the shot controlled and certain. The two men froze. "This is private property in the state of Tennessee," Ruth said, and her voice was not the confused old woman's voice anymore. It was the voice she had used in the trauma bay when a situation was deteriorating and she needed every person in the room to hear her immediately. "Under the Castle Doctrine, I am within my legal rights to use lethal force against anyone who enters my home without permission. You are currently standing on my porch without permission, And that man on my steps has a weapon. I am asking you once to step back to your vehicle and remove yourselves from my property." The armed man's eyes were moving between her face and the python. Ruth met his gaze without expression. She had pulled the trigger before. Not often. Once in a hospital parking garage, when an armed man had put a knife to a young orderly's throat, and she had been the one standing between them and the exit. She had fired once. She had not missed. She did not think about it often, and when she did not feel the guilt that people assume she should feel. She felt what she always felt after a crisis passed, a deep, exhausted clarity. She felt it now. "Lady," the flashlight man said slowly, "you need to think very carefully about what you're doing." "I've thought about it," Ruth said. "Step back." They looked at each other. Some calculation happened between them that Ruth could not read precisely, but understood in structure. They were measuring the cost of moving forward against the cost of withdrawal, and arriving at an answer she could have predicted from the moment she saw the python's barrel wasn't shaking. The armed man stepped down off the porch step. The flashlight man lowered his light. "We'll be back," the flashlight man said. "I'll be here," Ruth replied. She watched them cross to the SUV. She watched the doors close and the headlights sweep and the vehicle back down the fire road until its taillights disappeared into the storm. She did not lower the python until she could no longer see the lights. Then she went back inside, bolted the door, and stood for a moment with her back against it, breathing slowly through her nose the way she had learned to breathe when her body wanted to shake and she would not allow it. Jasper was watching her from his rug. "It's all right," she told him. He didn't look convinced. Ruth crossed to the table. Grace was white-faced and rigid, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other clutching the edge of the table. She had heard everything through the door. "They're gone," Ruth said. "For now." She checked the IV line, checked the compression bandage. Grace's blood pressure had dropped another point. She needed the wound monitored, and she needed warmth, and she needed to not be terrified. And Ruth could only control two of those three things. "They'll come back," Grace said. Her voice was barely a thread. "The Navarro people. They don't quit." Ruth pulled her chair close to the table and sat down. "Tell me what I need to know," Grace told her. Not everything at once. She was weak and the pain was interrupting her sentences. But enough. The Navarro Syndicate had been running product through the Cumberland region for 2 years, moving fentanyl and meth from Atlanta through the mountain counties to distribution points in Kentucky and Ohio. The Iron Serpents had controlled those corridors for a decade. When the Navarros moved in without negotiation or permission, Wade had made his position clear through a series of interventions that the newspapers had covered as a spike in unexplained property fires and missing persons reports in Morgan County. The Navarros had threatened retaliation against the families. Wade had moved Grace to her mother's house in Crossville 6 weeks ago, neutral territory, away from the club's properties. She had been driving back from her 34-week prenatal appointment in Cookville when the black SUV came up behind her on Route 27 near the state forest boundary and boxed her against the guardrail. The first shot came through the driver's window before she fully understood what was happening. She had hit the gas. They had rammed her. The car had gone through the guardrail and down the embankment, and she had crawled out through the passenger door and up through the snow because there was a light in the trees above her, and it was the only direction that wasn't downhill. Ruth listened to all of this without interrupting. When Grace finished, Ruth refilled the water glass on the table and handed it to her, and said nothing for a moment. "The SOS beacon," Ruth said finally. "Does it transmit GPS coordinates?" "Yes. It's a satellite unit. Wade has the matching receiver. He's always—" Grace stopped. Her face changed. "What?" Grace's hand pressed hard against her abdomen. A long, controlled exhale through her teeth, the kind of breathing someone does when they've been trained for pain management and are applying that training desperately. That's a contraction." Ruth was already on her feet. "How long since the last one?" "I don't. Maybe 8 minutes, maybe less." Another sharp breath. "Ruth, it's too early. Please tell me it's too early." 34 weeks with significant physical trauma and blood loss, Ruth said, her voice steady as a metronome. "The uterus can interpret the shock as a signal. It's called trauma-induced labor. It's uncommon but not rare." She was already opening the trauma bag, pulling out the clamps and the sterile scissors, and laying them on the clean dish towel she had spread across the counter. I have delivered babies before. Grace stared at her. In a hospital? Twice in a hospital, Ruth said. Once in a parking lot and once on a military transport in 1953. This is not making me feel better. I know. Push it aside. Focus on your breathing. Ruth moved the kerosene lamp closer and pulled the second lamp from the shelf above the stove, increasing the light around the table. She boiled water. She ran through the supply inventory in her head. Sterile dressings, umbilical clamps, a bulb syringe she had never expected to use, a clean set of towels she had been keeping for an emergency she had not precisely imagined. She filled the metal wash basin and set it on the stove to stay warm. She thought about Earl, not in a painful way, in the way you thought about the person who had known you best when you needed to remember who you were at your core. He had watched her work once, during the years they were both at Vanderbilt. He had come to pick her up from a double shift, and there had been a pileup on I-40, and she had worked for 6 hours straight without sitting down. Afterward, he had driven her home without saying much, and when they were almost there, he had said, I have never in my life seen anyone so certain of what they were supposed to be doing. She had laughed at the time. She didn't think he meant it the way it came out, not like a compliment, more like an observation of something fundamental. But she had never forgotten it. She was certain now. The contractions came harder and closer together over the following 2 hours. Grace bore them with a fierce, grinding determination that Ruth found remarkable. She had seen women fall apart with less provocation, and she had seen women hold themselves together through things that should have been impossible, and Grace Donovan fell solidly into the second category. Between contractions, she talked in short, deliberate sentences, anchoring herself to practical things. The hospital bag she had packed at her mother's house, the name they had chosen for the baby, the argument she and Wade had been having about the nursery color. He wanted gray, Grace said, during a relative lull, her voice thin but precise. I told him gray was depressing for a baby. He said gray was classic. I said classic was depressing for a baby. What color did you choose? Blue, he pretended to lose. Ruth smiled despite herself. Smart man. Outside, the storm continued. The wind had shifted from the northwest and was coming straight down the mountain now, driving the temperature further below zero and piling snow against the cabin's western wall with an industrious patience. The fire held. The lamps held. Jasper moved from his rug to a position near the kitchen table, lying with his chin on his front paws, watching Grace with the steady, sympathetic attention that dogs gave to the sick and the frightened, as though their presence itself were a kind of medicine. Maybe it was, Ruth thought. At 2:47 in the morning, the grandfather clock in the corner ticking steadily through the chaos, Grace's labor entered its final stage. Ruth worked with focused efficiency, talking Grace through each phase not with reassurance. She had learned in Korea that empty reassurance insulted intelligent people under duress, but with information. Here is what is happening. Here is what you need to do. Here is what I am doing and why. Grace did exactly what she was told. She was terrified and in agony, and she had a bullet hole in her shoulder, and she did exactly what she was told. And Ruth filed that away too in the compartment where she kept things that earned her respect. The baby arrived at 3:22 in the morning. He came into the world in the amber light of kerosene lamps with a November blizzard screaming outside, and his mother gripping the edge of an oak kitchen table. And the sound he made when Ruth cleared his airway, and he drew his first breath was the sound that Ruth had heard many times in her career, and that had never once failed to stop her heart for a single suspended second before she got back to work. Small, premature, fists clenched, face scrunched with outrage at the cold air and the bright light, and the indignity of existing in the world outside the warm dark where he had been growing undisturbed. But his color was good, and his lungs were working, and he was making his presence known to everyone in the cabin with a volume entirely disproportionate to his size. Ruth cut the cord and wrapped him in the warmest towel she had, the one she had kept on the shelf above the stove where the heat gathered. She cleared his nose and mouth carefully with the bulb syringe, checked his fingers and toes, pressed 2 fingers gently to the soft pulse in his neck. Strong, indignant, alive. She placed him on Grace's chest. Grace made a sound that Ruth could not describe afterward, except to say that it contained everything. She pressed her face against the baby's head, and her shoulders shook, and the tears ran into the baby's sparse pale hair, and Grace's hand moved over him with a frantic tenderness, counting fingers, learning the topography of him. He's perfect, Ruth said. She had not meant to say it. It was not clinical information, but it was true, and she said it. Is he? Grace couldn't finish the sentence. He is perfect, Ruth said again. He's early and he's small and he is going to need proper care soon, but he is breathing well and his color is good and he is already loudly objecting to everything, which is appropriate. Grace laughed, a broken, exhausted sound that was more tears than laughter. She pressed her lips to the baby's head again, and then she looked up at Ruth. And what was in her face was something Ruth had not expected, and for which she was not professionally prepared. It was the particular kind of gratitude that had no dimensions, that could not be spoken or repaid or adequately contained in any normal human transaction. It was the gratitude of someone who had been given back the thing they could not survive losing. Ruth had seen it before, in the trauma bay, in the field hospital in Korea, in the parking lot after the veterinarian had said Jasper would live. She recognized it. She turned away on the pretext of cleaning and checking the compression bandage. She had 4 more hours of work to do before she could rest. She needed to get Grace warm and stable and keep monitoring both patients. She was already thinking of the baby as a patient, already cataloging what he needed and what she had available, and what the gap between those two things represented. She thought, Wade Donovan's beacon signal has had 3 hours to reach whatever receiver his people carry. 3 hours in a storm that may or may not be penetrable by satellite signal. 3 hours during which the men from the black SUV may have called for reinforcements. She thought, when the storm breaks, or even before, whoever is coming is going to come. She set the cleaned instruments in the bowl and dried her hands and sat back down in Earl's rocking chair and watched the two of them, Grace and the baby, the lamplight warm across them both, and thought about what the morning was going to bring. Outside, something changed. The wind dropped by a degree, not much but enough to notice. The storm was not over, but it was considering stopping. Jasper raised his head from the floor and looked at the door. Not the threatening growl this time, something else. A tension in his ears that was attention rather than alarm. He was listening to something Ruth could not yet hear, something carried on the leading edge of the diminishing wind from very far away, from the direction of the mountain roads. A sound that, if you listened carefully enough through the last dying gusts of the storm, resembled thunder. Except the sky was beginning to clear. Ruth went to the window and peeled back the corner of the wool blanket by a careful inch. The sky to the east was beginning to gray with the first suggestion of dawn, the storm clouds breaking apart and rolling north. The snow had slowed to a fine, dry scatter. The mountain road was invisible in the darkness below, but Jasper was still listening, his ears fully forward now, and the sound was building. She knew it before she understood it. The body knew it first, a vibration that traveled through the floorboards and up through the soles of her boots, a subaudible rumble that the inner ear registered as warning before the conscious mind could name it. Then it was audible, unmistakably, coming from every direction at once, from the fire road below and from the upper trail to the north and from the logging road to the west, as though the mountain itself had arranged a convergence. Motorcycles, not one or two, not a dozen. Ruth let the blanket fall and stood in the center of the room and did the arithmetic she could already see coming. Grace's SOS beacon had reached its receiver. The Iron Serpents had a responsive membership, and they had spent a significant part of the night driving through a blizzard to get here. And they were going to arrive at a cabin where their president's wife was barely stable, and their president's newborn son was premature, and there was blood everywhere. And an old woman was the only person who had been on the premises. She needed to think about how that was going to look. She needed to think about what Wade Donovan was going to see when he drove up that road. She needed to think about what she was going to do when he saw it. Ruth looked at Grace, who had heard the sound and whose face had flooded with something that was relief and terror simultaneously. "That's Wade," Grace said, barely a whisper. "Yes," Ruth said, "I imagine it is." She went to the cabinet and considered the python in her hand. She turned it over once, feeling the familiar weight of it. Then she set it on the counter. She was not going to walk out onto a porch holding a weapon to face 100 armed men who were arriving to find their president's wife covered in blood and a stranger standing over her. The python stayed inside. She went to the stove and poured a cup of coffee. She stood with it in both hands, feeling the heat through the ceramic, and looked at the two of them, Grace and the boy. One more time. Grace was watching her. "He's going to come in here like a hurricane," Grace said quietly. "I know. He doesn't. When he's scared, he comes out angry. He doesn't mean—" "Grace." Ruth met her eyes. I have handled difficult men for 50 years. Let me worry about Wade. The engines were very close now. The cups in the cabinet began to rattle. Ruth squared her shoulders. She set down the coffee cup. She ran her hands once down the front of her flannel shirt, a gesture she didn't fully understand herself. Perhaps straightening herself, perhaps grounding herself, the way you touch something solid before walking into uncertain territory. She crossed to the door. She put her hand on the bolt. Outside, the mountain rumbled. She had spent the last 8 years learning how to be alone, not just tolerating it, but settling into it, the way a house settles over decades, finding its permanent posture. After Earl died, a heart attack in his workshop on a Tuesday afternoon in October, swift and without drama, which was very much how Earl had wanted everything in his life to go. She had sold the house in Nashville and the second car and most of the furniture, and she had driven up to this cabin on this mountain with 2 boxes of books, in her medical bag, in the dog, and she had not been back to the city once. Her daughter Karen had called every Sunday for the first 2 years, then every other Sunday, then once a month. They were not estranged, not precisely. Karen had her own family in Phoenix, her own life, her own gravitational pull, and Ruth understood that adult children were not obligated to orbit their parents indefinitely. But she had noticed the calls becoming shorter and more perfunctory over time, the way all maintenance relationships did when the parties involved were too busy or too tired or too careful to do the work of sustaining them. Last Sunday's call had lasted 9 minutes. They had discussed the weather and a television program Karen was watching and a brief report on the grandchildren's school activities. And then Karen had said she had to start dinner, and Ruth had said of course, and they had said goodbye. Ruth did not want to be the kind of woman who needed to be maintained. She had built her life on this mountain around self-sufficiency of the most deliberate kind. She cut her own firewood. She kept a kitchen garden in the summer months. She drove the 38 miles to Coalfield for supplies once a month, buying in bulk, carrying everything in the bed of the old Ford pickup that she had maintained herself since Earl had taught her basic engine work 30 years ago. She knew every inch of this mountain. She knew which trails went where, and which springs ran year-round, and which sections of the fire road became impassable in February, and which did not. She knew with the intimate specificity of long habitation what this place sounded like at 3 in the morning in November, and what it sounded like when something unusual had entered it. She had built a life here that required nothing from anyone. Now, a woman's baby was sleeping against her chest in Ruth's cabin, and the sound of 50 engines or 100 engines or more than she could count was coming up every road the mountain offered. And the man who was leading them was going to step out of that formation and look at her porch and look at her door. And whatever he was going to think in that first unguarded moment was going to determine how the next 10 minutes went. Ruth thought about Korea, not the blood and the cold and the particular exhaustion of working 3 surgical tables in rotation during a counter-offensive push, but the morning after, the specific gray dawn when you had worked through the night and the crisis had passed, and you stood outside the tent in the cold, and you were still there, still functioning, still yourself despite everything that had tried to unmake you during the hours just past. That feeling of quiet, durable continuity. I was here before this happened, and I am here now, and I will be here after it ends. She had that feeling now. The first headlights swept across the cabin's western wall. Then more, coming from the south, and from the upper trail to the north, the sound of engines working down through steep switchbacks. The rumble became a roar, became a presence that she felt in her chest cavity. She heard Jasper rise from the rug behind her. He came and sat beside her legs, not leaning against them. He was not a leaning dog, but close, choosing proximity without dependence. Ruth thought that was about right. She put her hand on the bolt. The first bike crested the rise above the fire road, and its headlights swept across the cabin porch, and then another behind it, and then 6, and then 12, and the sound of all of them together was less like thunder now than like something more primary than that, like weather itself, like something the mountain was producing out of its own depths. Ruth opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit her in her clean wall, the storm's final exhalation before it released the mountain to the dawn. The sky to the east was bone white, and the first faint coral light was beginning at the horizon. And in that light, the motorcycles came up the road and spread across the clearing and the driveway and the yard and the tree line beyond it until there was nothing in her field of vision, In any direction she looked, that was not the Iron Serpents. She had seen large groups of men before. She had worked the Cook County emergency room on a Saturday night. She had been in Seoul during the worst of the push north. She had attended her daughter's college graduation and stood in a stadium of 40,000 and not felt especially small. This was different. This was specific in a way that large crowds were not. Every one of these men was looking at the same thing. She was the thing they were looking at. And in the growing dawn light, with the blood on her apron and the kerosene lamp glow visible through the cracked open door behind her, and the gunshot woman and the premature infant inside, she understood exactly what she looked like to them. She stood up straight. The engines cut one by one and then in clusters and then all at once, in a wave of silence that rolled across the clearing from front to back. The sudden quiet was the loudest thing Ruth had ever heard. A man climbed off the lead bike. He was large, not just tall, but large in the way that came from years of physical work and physical confrontation. The kind of size that wasn't about the gym, but about a life lived in opposition to things that pushed back. Dark beard, close-cropped, eyes that had the particular qualities she had seen before in men who commanded other men in dangerous situations. Not cold exactly, but operating on a frequency just slightly to the left of ordinary human feeling, where the signal came in clean because all the noise had been filtered out. He wore the president patch. Wade Donovan walked across the clearing toward the porch, and behind him 2 men fell into step without being asked, and 100 more watched in complete silence. And the only sound on the mountain was the wind in the pines and the soft creak of the porch boards as the Iron Serpent's president set his boot on the first step and looked at Ruth McAllister with eyes that were grief and fury and desperate hope, all in a single unbearable expression. His gaze moved to her apron, to the blood on her hands, to the door behind her. His jaw worked once. "Where is my wife?" he said. His voice was controlled, barely. Ruth looked at him for one full second. She cataloged him the way she had always cataloged patients in crisis. His color, his breathing, the set of his shoulders, the quality of his hands. She understood in that second what grace had meant. When he was scared, he came out angry. She could see it in the line of his neck, the held-back ferocity of a man who had learned to put terror into the shape of rage, because that was a form he knew how to manage. She had handled difficult men for 50 years. She had worked 31 years in a level 1 trauma center where difficult men arrived regularly, broken in ways they did not know how to be broken, angry because anger was the only armor they had ever been taught to make. She had worked through combat operations in Korea where difficult men were the only kind available, and you learned their language out of necessity and spoke it back to them clearly and without flinching, and they responded to that clarity the way all people responded to it, with something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it, the recognition of encountering someone who was not afraid of what you contained. "She's inside," Ruth said. "So is your son. They're both alive." She held his gaze. "Before you go in, I need you to hear me. She lost a significant amount of blood. She has a gunshot wound to the right shoulder that I have packed and stabilized, but that needs a proper surgical evaluation as soon as we can safely move her. The baby is 34 weeks, premature, healthy by every measure I can assess, but he needs a NICU as soon as possible. That is the medical situation. Whatever else you need to say or do out here, say it or do it quickly, because both of them need more than I can provide, and every minute matters." Wade stared at her. Behind him, one of his men moved, a large, scarred man with the vice president patch, taking a step forward with the instinct of someone whose job was to put his body between his president and any possible threat. Wade held up one hand without looking back. The man stopped. Wade looked at Ruth for another long moment. Whatever he was looking for in her face, she didn't know. She gave him nothing but the truth of what she just said. "My boy," he said. "Healthy," Ruth said, loud. Something happened in his face. The rigid control buckled, just briefly. A single deep fissure in the structure of it, like a seam in old wood coming visible under pressure. He pressed his lips together. He looked at the door. He looked at Ruth. "Let me see them," he said. Ruth stepped aside. Wade Donovan walked past her into the cabin, and behind him the mountain was silent, and the dawn was coming up over the eastern ridge in long horizontal bars of pale gold. And Ruth stood on the porch in the cold and listened for what came next. The inside of the cabin, in the pale dawn light filtering through the gaps in the window coverings, looked like what it was, the sight of a night's worth of desperate work. Wade Donovan stood in the doorway and saw it all at once. The kitchen table, slick with dried blood, darkened to near black at the center, where the heaviest loss had pooled before Ruth's compression packed it off. The IV line still running into Grace's arm, the saline bag nearly depleted, the steel bowl of iodine on the counter with the instruments in it, the bloody towels in the corner, the scorched and blood-soaked white maternity shirt balled on the floor where Ruth had cut it away. The metallic smell of copper heavy in the warm air over the smell of wood smoke and kerosene. For 4 full seconds, Wade did not move. His hands were open at his sides and his face had gone very still. The kind of stillness that wasn't calm but was the moment just before something broke. Then the baby cried. Not a distress cry, an inconvenient declaratory cry. The sound of a small person who had been doing perfectly well resting and now had an opinion about being disturbed by the influx of cold air through the open door. It came from the living area, from the plush sofa near the wood stove where Ruth had moved Grace and the baby after the delivery was complete, where she had propped Grace with pillows and tucked the extra wool blanket around both of them and moved the second kerosene lamp close to add warmth. Wade crossed the room in 3 strides. He stopped at the edge of the sofa and looked down, and everything in his posture and his face and the set of his massive leather-jacketed shoulders changed at once, like a charge discharging. All that controlled fury releasing into something that had no structural defense against it at all. Grace was pale and exhausted, and her right shoulder was wrapped in 4 layers of compression bandage, and she had dark circles under her eyes that spoke of shock and blood loss, and a night spent past the edge of her endurance. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She was holding their son against her chest, the boy wrapped in Ruth's blue plaid blanket, his face scrunched with the private intensity of a newborn registering the world for the first time. Wade! Grace's voice was almost nothing, just the shape of his name. Wade dropped to his knees on the hardwood floor beside the sofa. He did it without ceremony or self-consciousness, the way you dropped to your knees in church as a child before you knew enough to be embarrassed by it. He pressed his forehead against Grace's uninjured shoulder, and his chest moved with a single shuddering breath that he held for a long moment before releasing it. He was not crying. His eyes were dry, and his face was pressed against the leather of his own jacket that Grace still wore over her shoulders, and his hands were very careful. Enormous tattooed hands that could and had done considerable violence in their time, resting now against Grace's arm with an almost absurd gentleness. Ruth watched from the doorway. She gave them 30 seconds. She needed to check the IV and the compression bandage, and Grace needed monitoring, and she did not have the luxury of sentiment in the same quantity that this moment deserved. I need to come through, she said. Wade lifted his head. He looked at her, and what was in his eyes was not what she'd braced for. It was not anger. It was not the dangerous suspension she had seen on the porch. The man holding himself together against the weight of fear by applying rage to the structure. It was something much simpler and much more difficult to look at directly. It was a man who had been shown what he almost lost. He moved aside without speaking. Ruth checked the IV line, assessed Grace's blood pressure, examined the compression bandage for any new seeping. The shoulder was holding. She noted the baby's color and respiration. Still good, still indignant, already working on an understanding of the world that seemed to run primarily toward objection. She needs a proper surgical consult within the next few hours, Ruth said without turning from her work. The bullet exited cleanly, and I've managed the bleeding, but there may be tissue damage I can't assess here. He needs a neonatal unit. Premature lungs can hold for a while, but he needs monitoring I'm not equipped for. I have a medical team, Wade said. His voice was controlled again. The management recovered. There's a doctor with us, our club physician. Ruth turned. You travel with a physician? Dr. Philip Holden. He's been with us 8 years. He's a licensed internist, not a surgeon, but he can stabilize and assess until we can move her. Ruth processed this. Where are you moving her? There's a facility in Knoxville, private. Off the books but properly staffed. Surgeons, NICU, the full suite. We use it for situations like this. Ruth did not ask what other situations those were. How long to get there? Road conditions, 3 hours, maybe 3.5. She can make that if she doesn't deteriorate in the next hour and the transport is smooth. Ruth looked at him directly. She needs warmth, minimal movement, and someone monitoring her blood pressure every 15 minutes for the first hour. Your physician needs to check her lung sounds. Right side was diminished when she arrived. It's improved, but it needs to stay that way. Wade nodded. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and produced a phone. A satellite phone, she noted, not a cellular model. He put it to his ear, said 4 words to someone on the other end, and put it away. Holden will be in 2 minutes, he said. From outside the cabin came the sound of movement, controlled, purposeful, the specific sound of a large organized group realigning itself. No voices, minimal engine noise. Ruth had encountered military organization before, and she knew it when she heard it. The Iron Serpents were not a rabble. Grace, who had been watching Wade with the alert, exhausted intensity of someone trying to hold everything in their field of vision at once, said, "They told you, didn't they? About the cartel, about what happened." "Boone intercepted one of them on the mountain road," Wade said. His voice had dropped half a register. "Tried to run, didn't get far. He's been informative." "What does that mean?" Grace asked. Wade said nothing. "Wade. He's alive," Wade said. "He's been informative." Ruth went to the stove and poured water into the wash basin. She kept her attention on what she was doing and her opinions to herself. She had lived long enough to understand that the world sorted itself into different kinds of order, and that the kind she had spent her career maintaining, clinical, procedural, documented, was not the only kind that existed, and that the others were not always wrong in their outcomes, even when they were very different in their methods. The door opened and a man came in who was clearly the physician. He had the walk of someone assessing a room the moment he entered it, the same compulsive inventory Ruth had always done herself. Medium build, 50s, a neatly trimmed gray beard, wearing a leather vest with a bottom rocker that said Iron Serpents and a separate patch that read Medic. He carried a large, hard-sided case. He looked at Ruth. She looked at him. "Dr. Holden," he said. "Ruth McAllister," she said. "RN retired. Vanderbilt ER, 31 years. Korea before that." He nodded, absorbing this. "Can you brief me?" Ruth briefed him in 2 minutes flat. Wound location, exit trajectory, blood loss estimation, interventions applied, current vitals, lung sounds, IV status, baby's condition, and gestational age. He listened without interrupting, asking 2 precise, clarifying questions. He was competent. She could see it in how he moved to Grace's side and began his own assessment. Efficient, correct, the hands of someone who had done this under pressure before. She stepped back and let him work. Wade was standing near the fireplace, far enough back to give the physician room, near enough to watch. His arms were crossed and his jaw was set, and he was managing something internally that she could see in the small muscles of his face. The constant, low-level effort of a man holding himself at a particular tension, not releasing and not escalating. The door opened again, and Boone Keller came in. The vice president, the large scarred man who had started to move toward Ruth on the porch before Wade stopped him. He had a face that had been rearranged more than once in its life and seemed to have settled into its final form with a kind of philosophical acceptance of that fact. He went directly to Wade, spoke low into his ear. Wade's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Something sharpened in them. "Excuse me," he said to the room in general, and went out the door. Ruth noted this. She had been watching the cabin's entries and exits since Grace arrived, and she continued to do so now. Not out of explicit calculation, but out of the habit of awareness that a life in emergency medicine installed and that never fully switched off. Holden looked up from his assessment. "You did excellent work," he said to Ruth. His tone was straightforward, not complimentary in the practice way doctors complimented nurses when they wanted something, but factual. "Given what you were working with." "She cooperated," Ruth said. "That helped. I'd like to start another line and replace your saline with a colloid if you have nothing against it." "I don't have colloid. Use what you need from your case." He nodded, already opening the hard-sided case. Grace turned her head to find Ruth across the room. "Ruth." Ruth came to the sofa. "Thank you," Grace said. The words were inadequate, and she knew it, and Ruth could see that she knew it. And the inadequacy of them seemed to cause her a specific distress separate from everything else she was carrying. "I don't—" She stopped. "I don't have words for it." "You don't need words," Ruth said. She sat on the edge of the chair near the sofa, Earl's rocking chair, which she had moved to this position to keep watch during the labor. "Rest. Let Dr. Holden work. You have a son who needs you in good shape." Grace looked at the baby in her arms. The boy was asleep now, tucked against her with the profound, self-satisfied sleep of the very newly born. His face relaxed and open, one tiny fist pressed against his cheek. "We haven't said it out loud yet," Grace said softly. "The name." Ruth waited. I want to change it," Grace said. She looked up at Ruth, and something in her face was both careful and certain, the way people looked when they were about to say something that mattered and were aware of its weight. "I want to name him Earl." Ruth did not move. The cabin was quiet around her. The fire's soft crackle, Holden's efficient work sounds, the distant organized murmur of men outside. Earl. The name sat in the room like a physical object, like something she could reach out and touch. She had not expected that. She had not expected any of this. She had not expected a single thing that had happened since Jasper raised his head from the rug at 9:47 the previous evening. "Grace," Ruth said. Her voice was level. She was working to keep it that way. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," Grace said. "I want to. He deserves a name that means something." She looked at Ruth steadily. "Your husband saved us too. Whatever you kept of him in this cabin tonight, whatever made you into who you are, that saved us too." Ruth looked at the boy sleeping against his mother's chest. She pressed her lips together once, firmly, and looked away at the fire. The fire did what fires did. Burned without comment, without sentiment, without any particular awareness of the weight of the room. It was warming. It was a thing she had always appreciated about fires. They had no opinion about what you were going through. They simply continued, hot and reliable and indifferent. And that indifference was its own kind of comfort when everything else was asking something of you. Earl, her husband of 41 years, who had grown up in Harlan County and worked his whole life with his hands, and who had, toward the end, taken to sitting on this same porch in this same mountain. Silence and saying very little about it, but being, she had known, deeply content in a way that he had spent most of his life not quite reaching. He had been a man who loved the world with a specific individual attention, not the broad philosophical love of a person who found all of it beautiful, but the focused, careful love of someone who had found the particular parts of it that were his and held on to them with both hands. Her, the mountain, the worn paperback westerns on the nightstand, the 2 cups of coffee in the morning, one for each of them, without discussion or negotiation, simply because that was how a morning was supposed to begin. She had not said his name out loud in a long time. She said it inside herself when she sat in his chair or made his cup of coffee, but saying it out loud was different. It summoned him into the room in a way that was sometimes more than she was prepared for. She had grown careful about it. Now someone had said it for her, and the name had arrived in this ruined, blood-stained, kerosene-lit room and settled there with a permanence that felt architectural, load-bearing, the kind of thing that would still be in the structure of this place long after she was not. She had not cried since the day they put Earl in the ground. She had stood at the graveside in the October cold, and she had thanked the minister, and she had driven home alone, and she had put the kettle on, and she had sat at the kitchen table with both cups of coffee, both of them, the second one untouched, and she had not cried. She had decided in some wordless architectural way that crying was something she was done with, not out of stoicism, but out of a recognition that she had been hollowed out to a depth below which tears were no longer the appropriate response. Below that depth, there was just continuation. The next day, and the next, and the next. She was very close to that depth right now, and she was fighting it, quietly and without anyone in the room being aware of the fight. "Earl is a good name," Ruth said finally. Her voice was steady. It cost her something. Grace reached out and took Ruth's hand. Outside, the sound of the organized murmur changed. A single voice, Wade's, carrying even through the log walls, said something short and definitive, and then it was quiet again, and then boots on the porch. Wade came back inside. He looked at Grace and the baby for a moment, and in that moment his face was entirely open. Unguarded in the way that men who spent their lives being hard were only unguarded in front of the thing they loved most. Then he recovered himself and looked at Ruth. "I need you to come outside," he said. "Why?" "Because the man we pulled off the mountain road has been telling us things, and some of them are about you, and I think you should hear them yourself." Ruth looked at Holden, who nodded to indicate he had Grace's situation managed. She stood up, smoothing her apron. "All right," she said. She had not been back through the front door since she had watched Wade enter the cabin. Now she stepped out into the morning, and what she saw in the full light of dawn was different from what she had seen in the breaking dark, different in scale. She had registered the number of bikes and men, but had not fully processed the geography of it, how they had arranged themselves in the clearing, along the tree line, up the fire road as far as she could see in both directions. They had cut their engines and dismounted, and now stood or sat in clusters, talking quietly among themselves. The disciplined stillness of men who were waiting for orders and were comfortable waiting. There were 47 of them. She counted, because she always counted. At the edge of the tree line to the south, near a large spruce whose lower branches were heavy with snow, two iron serpents stood on either side of a man who was sitting on the ground with his back against the tree trunk and his hands bound behind him. The man was in an expensive dark raincoat, and his face was swollen on the left side where someone, had made its opinions known. He was the man with the flashlight. He had threatened her on her own porch. Wade walked her to within 10 feet of the man. He stopped there. "Tell her," Wade said, to the man on the ground. The man looked at Ruth, then at Wade, then at Ruth. He had the look of someone who has been recalculating survival odds for several hours and has not been satisfied with any of the results. "We were hired to intercept the woman," the man said. His voice was flat with the particular flatness of fear. "Navarro's people, we weren't supposed to. It was supposed to look like an accident. Ran her off the road. She got out. We followed the blood." "And," Wade said, "and the old woman." He glanced at Ruth. "She came out on the porch. We tried to get her to let us in, and she put a gun on us." A pause. "She ran us off." Wade said nothing. "But that's not what I told them when we called it in," the man continued. His voice dropped. "I told Navarro's coordinator that the woman was dead, that we found her in the cabin and the old woman had—" He stopped. Ruth understood. She understood what he had said to his superiors, and she understood why. He had needed to report a completed job to avoid consequences for a failed one. And the most efficient lie, the one that would direct Navarro's response away from himself and towards someone else, was the one that put the failure on her. "He told them I killed her," Ruth said, not a question. "He told his people you finished the job," Wade said, "which is what he told us when we arrived, which is why—" He paused, and she could hear in the pause the ghost of what he had nearly done, what he had been primed to do before he went through that door and found Grace alive. "Which is why the first 30 seconds mattered." Ruth looked at the man against the tree. He was watching her with the calculating attention of someone who still believed there was an angle to play. "What happens to him now?" Ruth asked. Wade was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what you want." She had not expected that either. She looked at him. "He tried to have you included in this," Wade said. "He put your name in front of people who respond to names by removing them. That's a debt." "Call the sheriff," Ruth said. Wade looked at her for a long moment. The scarred man, Boone, who was standing just off to his left, made a sound that might have been skepticism or might have been a laugh suppressed. "He has information about the Navarro operation," Wade said. "What they have in the region, who they move through, where the supply lines run. The sheriff gets that information. It gets buried or it gets leaked back. It's happened before." "Then call the FBI," Ruth said. "Same problem, different agency." "Then call them both and let the overlap work against the leak," Ruth said. "I've been alive for 74 years, and I have never once seen anything good come from keeping a man off the official record when the official record is the right place for him. You hand him to law enforcement with everything he's told you documented, and you let the process work." Wade studied her. "You know that's not how we usually handle it," he said. "I know," Ruth said. "I'm telling you how I want it handled." The silence stretched. Boone was looking at his president with an expression Ruth could not fully read. Something between admiration and disbelief. Wade said slowly, "If I do it your way, the Navarro people will know within 48 hours that he's in custody. They'll know he's talking. They'll move their assets." "You have 47 men on this mountain," Ruth said. "You have communications and logistics I can't fully imagine. If you can't work faster than an organization's ability to move its assets, once you know where those assets are, then that's a different conversation. But it's not my conversation. You asked me what I want. That's what I want." Another long silence. The light was fully up now. The sky washed pale blue above the white-capped ridgeline. the snow on the clearing brilliant in the morning sun. It was going to be a cold, clear day, the kind of day that made November in the mountains look like a calendar photograph. Wade turned to Boone. "Get Reyes on the phone. Tell him we're doing this on the record." Boone's eyebrows went up by a millimeter. "Do it," Wade said. Boone produced a phone and stepped away. Wade looked at Ruth. Something in his expression had shifted, not softened precisely, but changed in its register. There was a quality to it that she had seen before, in patients who had been disarmed by unexpected honesty, who had come in braced for one kind of interaction and found themselves in a different one. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. The question was not clinical, it was curious. 11 years, Ruth said. "Alone?" "Since my husband died, yes." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him process this. A man who lived surrounded by men, who structured his life around collective obligation and collective loyalty, trying to understand a life organized around its own absence. "That's a long time," he said. "It's been the right amount of time for what I needed," Ruth said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Grace told me what you said to her, before you delivered the baby, what you told her about your husband." Ruth had told Grace nothing about Earl. She had mentioned his name when Grace asked about the rocking chair, and Ruth had said, "That was my husband's." That was all. But people heard things in the small facts that you offered without intending to, especially people who were frightened and paying close attention, filtering every piece of information for comfort. She supposed Earl's chair and Earl's name, and the whole weight of the cabin's 8 years of inhabited solitude, had communicated something she hadn't deliberately said. "She named him Earl," Ruth said. "I didn't ask her to." "I know." A pause. "I'm glad she did." Ruth looked at him sharply, checking for performance. She found none. "I've been thinking," Wade said, "about what we owe you." "You don't owe me anything," Ruth said. "That's not how we see it." "With respect," Ruth said, "I didn't do what I did because I wanted to be owed for it. I did it because she was bleeding on my floor and there was no one else. There's no transaction here." "I understand that," Wade said. "I'm not talking about a transaction." He reached into the inner pocket of his vest and withdrew something she recognized by type, if not by specifics. A challenge coin, heavy brass, the kind that certain organizations use to mark membership and obligation. He held it out to her. Ruth did not take it immediately. "This coin means something specific to us," Wade said. "Any man who wears our patch, anywhere in this country, who sees that coin knows what it means. It means you are protected. It means whatever you need, whatever goes wrong, whatever comes at you on this mountain or anywhere else, you show that coin and it ends." Ruth looked at the coin in his palm. The iron serpent's emblem on one side, the serpent coiled around a wheel, the chapter rocker below it. On the other, a set of numbers she took to be charter identifiers and a single word: blood. "I live alone on a mountain," Ruth said. "I keep my own counsel. I'm not looking for protection or resources or anything that changes what my life is up here." "I know," Wade said. "Take it anyway." She took it. It was heavier than it looked. She turned it over once in her fingers and slipped it into the pocket of her apron, next to the cloth she had been using all night. "There's something else," Wade said. He looked away for a moment toward the tree line in the direction of the bound man. "The Navarros know this cabin's location. Their coordinator was told a job got done here. When the man in custody doesn't check in, and when they can't locate him, they're going to wonder what happened and where he went. They know this address." Ruth was quiet. "We can't change that," Wade said, "but we can make sure nothing comes of it, starting today." "Starting today how?" Ruth asked. He told her, or rather he outlined the shape of it: rotating pairs of his people on the fire road below, surveillance on the logging road to the west, regular presence on the property in the form of firewood delivery and supply runs and routine maintenance visits that would make the cabin a constant point of contact for people who would notice if anything changed. Ruth listened to all of this with a carefully neutral expression. "You're proposing to station your people on my mountain," she said. "Discreetly," Wade said. "You won't see them unless you need to. I've been managing this mountain on my own for 11 years. I know. I'm not a person who needs managing. I know that too." A pause. "But the Navarros are a different category of problem than the ones you've been managing. And I can't leave you exposed after what Grace and I—" He stopped. The controlled quality of his voice became effortful for a moment. "I can't leave you exposed," he said again. "That's the fact of it. If you want a reason that isn't about debt or transaction, that's the reason. Ruth stood in the cold morning air and looked at the 47 bikers arranged across her clearing. And she thought about 8 years of Sundays with 2 cups of coffee and Earl's rocking chair, and the window coverings she put up every winter, and the particular quality of silence that a mountain had when no one had been on it for weeks. She thought about the baby sleeping against Grace's chest, with his fist pressed against his cheek. Earl, what you kept of him saved us too. She put her hand in her apron pocket and felt the weight of the coin. Discreetly, she said. You won't know we're there, Wade said, unless you need us. She looked at him for a moment. One condition. Name it. The fire road. Don't let your people ride up the fire road above 30 miles an hour. There are deer at the upper bend every morning between 6 and 8, and I've been watching the same two does for 3 years, and I would like to continue watching them. Wade stared at her. The deer, he said. The deer, Ruth said. Something crossed his face, something she couldn't fully name, but that had in it the quality of a man revising his understanding of a situation in real time. He pressed his lips together. He nodded. The deer are protected, he said. Inside the cabin, the baby began to cry again. The same declaratory objection to the world's indifference, vigorous and certain and entirely without doubt. Outside on the mountain, 47 iron serpents heard it, and the murmur of their voices changed in a way that Ruth could not have precisely described, but that she understood. It was the sound of large groups of people when something small and new and alive announced itself. The involuntary softening that happened to even the hardest men in the presence of the very newly born. Boone came back and reported something to Wade in a low voice. Wade nodded. He looked at Ruth. The transport van is 20 minutes out, he said. We'll have Grace and the baby on the road to Knoxville within the hour. Ruth nodded. She turned back toward the cabin. There was work to do, monitoring to complete, vitals to run one more time, a briefing to give Dr. Holden on everything she had observed through the night, a set of notes to write by hand because she had always written notes by hand, and she was not about to stop. Handoff preparation. The same thing she had done at the end of every shift for 31 years, making sure the next set of hands had everything they needed to continue the work well. She had her hand on the door when Wade said behind her, Mrs. McAllister. She turned. He was standing in this cleared space of the porch, morning light across him, and his expression was the open one again, the unguarded register that she had only seen in front of Grace and the baby. As though she had been added, without his fully planning it, to the category of things in front of which he did not manage himself. Thank you, he said. Ruth looked at him for one moment. Take care of them, she said, and went inside. The next hour was the particular focused work of preparation and handoff. Dr. Holden briefed the transport team. Ruth ran one final set of vitals on Grace, checked the compression bandage one last time, and handed Holden a handwritten page of notes from the night, times of significant events, interventions, observed changes, current status, things to watch. He read them carefully and folded them into his case. Grace, when Ruth came to say goodbye, reached up with her uninjured arm and held Ruth's hand for a long moment without speaking. Ruth let her. The baby was warm and fed and sleeping against Grace's chest with the same profound satisfaction that he had been sleeping with all morning. Earl, a small person making his permanent arrangements in the world, entirely unaware of everything that had surrounded his arrival. You'll come to see him, Grace said. It was not a question. If you'd like me to, Ruth said. I'd like you to, Grace said. Ruth nodded once. She stepped back and let the transport team do their work. 40 minutes after the transport van pulled away down the fire road with Grace and the baby and Dr. Holden and a 4-bike Iron Serpent's escort, the clearing in front of Ruth's cabin was empty again. The bikers had left in organized groups, the main body down the fire road, 2 riders up the logging road to the west, 1 more up the north trail, their departures staggered and purposeful. Within 30 minutes, the mountain sounded like itself again. Wind in the pines, distant crow calls, the creek below the east ridge moving under its early ice. Jasper came and sat beside Ruth on the porch steps. She sat with him for a while, watching the snow on the clearing settle into the impressions that 47 sets of boots and 47 motorcycles had left in it. The impressions were deep and specific. You could read the night in them, in a way, the organized arrival and the standing about, and the organized departure. By tomorrow or the day after, new snow would cover them. The coffee tin on the stove inside was nearly empty. She had been up for more than 24 hours. Her hands ached and her knees ached, and there was a stiffness in her lower back that was going to require the specific application of the good heating pad and an early bedtime. She should go inside. She should make coffee and drink it and then sleep. She stayed on the steps for a while longer. She put her hand in her apron pocket and felt the coin, the weight of it, the specific heft of brass, the raised edge of the serpent on one side. She thought about Earl's chair inside, and the 2 coffee cups every morning, and the gas station receipt still folded in the paperback on the side table. She thought about Karen's 9-minute phone calls. She thought about what it had felt like to stand at the kitchen table with both cups and not cry because there was nothing left to cry with, only the continuation of days. She thought about what Grace had said. Whatever made you into who you are, that saved us too. She had not thought of herself as still being made into something. She had thought she was finished. Not in a dark way, not in a giving up way, but in the way that you were finished when you had arrived at the final form of a thing, the last version, the one that just continued until it stopped. She was not sure that was still accurate. The sun had climbed high enough now to clear the eastern ridgeline, and the snow on the clearing blazed white in the direct light. Jasper put his chin on her knee. His warm weight on her leg was familiar and grounding, the physical anchor of the living world. Ruth put her hand on his head. Inside the cabin, in the particular quality of silence that a space held after it had been full of people, and then emptied again, Earl's rocking chair sat beside the fire. The fire had burned down to coals. She would need to feed it before long. Ruth stood up. She went inside and built the fire back up and made coffee and stood at the counter drinking it, looking at the kitchen table that still bore the evidence of the night. The darkened stains, the tape residue from the IV line, the scattered detritus of 2 hours of intensive work. She would clean it. She would put the cabin back in order with the thoroughness that was both habit and preference, the way she had always managed the aftermath of difficulty. And then she would sit in Earl's chair and watch the fire and think about what came next. She did not know yet. That was new. For 8 years she had known exactly what came next. She had built her life on the reliable repetition of known things, and she had found in that repetition not happiness precisely, but something more durable than happiness, the absence of surprise, the deep settledness of a day that was going to unfold the way she expected it to unfold. She did not know what was going to unfold now. Not tomorrow, not next week, not when the Knoxville hospital discharged Grace and the baby, not when the legal proceedings against the man in the tree line ground through whatever process Wade had initiated by picking up the phone and doing it the way Ruth had asked him to. She did not know, and sitting with that unknowing, turning it over, the coin heavy in her apron pocket, Ruth found that the feeling was not what she would have expected. It was not peace exactly. Peace was what she'd had for 8 years, or what she'd told herself it was. This was something older, something that went further back to the field hospital, in the trauma bay, in the parking lot, in the thing Earl had said on the drive home. She was certain of what she was supposed to be doing. She hadn't felt that in a very long time. Outside, on the upper fire road bend, 2 does moved through the snow at the tree line. Ruth watched them through the window, their breath rising in small clouds in the cold morning air, their movements precise and unhurried, as though the night had not happened and the mountain was the same mountain it had always been. Which it was. Mountains endured. That was what they were for. Ruth finished her coffee and set the cup in the sink and began to clean the kitchen table. The weeks that followed had a different texture than the years preceding them. Ruth noticed it in the small things first, the way you noticed a shift in weather before you noticed the weather itself. A subtle pressure change, the quality of light slightly altered. On the 3rd day after the storm, she found a cord of split white oak stacked neatly on the north side of her porch, perfectly seasoned wood she had not cut and had not asked for. On the 7th day, a canvas bag appeared on the porch rail containing 2 weeks of premium dog food, the expensive kind with the salmon on the label that Jasper occasionally received on birthdays and that she would never have bought for herself out of habitual economies. On the 12th day, a truck she did not recognize came slowly up the fire road, and 2 men, leather vests, iron serpents patches, quiet and polite, knocked on her door and asked if they could look at the generator shed and back. She let them. They spent an hour in the shed and left without explanation. She checked the shed afterward and found that someone had replaced the aging brushes in the generator motor and serviced the fuel system and cleared the intake of debris from the last storm. Things she would have gotten around to herself in the spring. The generator now ran quieter and steadier than it had in 3 years. She did not see the two riders at the fire road bend. She was not supposed to. But twice, when she drove the road to Coalfield for supplies, she passed a parked bike in the wide shoulder at the lower switchback, and the rider nodded at her truck as she went by. A single acknowledgement that was not intrusive and was not nothing. She found she did not mind. This surprised her. She had expected to mind. She had built her resistance to being minded about into the structure of her days with considerable architectural attention. The way you designed a house to manage light and wind, deliberately so the result felt natural. She had not wanted to be checked on or looked after or made the subject of another person's concern. Concern felt like prelude to helplessness. She had watched what happened to women of her generation when they became the objects of other people's care, and she had decided very early and very firmly that she would die working rather than die being managed. But this was not that. What Wade had organized was not management. It was, she turned the word over looking for the right one. Presence. Background presence. The way a town was a background presence when you lived near it. You didn't rely on the town necessarily, but you knew it was there, and that knowledge did something quiet and foundational to the texture of your days. She had not had background presence for 8 years. She had not known what she was missing until she had it again. On the 14th day after the storm, Grace called. She called on the satellite phone Wade had left with Ruth before departing. He had pressed it into her hand beside the truck and said, "Call this number if you need anything," before they drove down the mountain. The phone had sat on Ruth's kitchen counter, uncharged, for 3 days before she plugged it in out of a sense of obligation. Then she had left it charged and untouched for 11 more days. When it rang, she picked it up before the second ring. Grace's voice was different than it had been in the cabin, fuller, steadier, the thread of it no longer worn thin by shock and blood loss. She sounded like herself. Ruth could hear it. "Earl is 4 pounds 3 ounces as of this morning," Grace said. "The neonatologist says he could be home in 3 weeks if he keeps this up." "That's good," Ruth said. "That's very good. His lungs are strong. He's been yelling at the nurses." A pause that contained a smile. "The NICU nurses say they haven't had a preemie with his volume before." "He announced himself clearly from the beginning," Ruth said. "I know." Another pause. "I told the nurses about you. All of it. The one named Rebecca asked if you were real." Ruth made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I told her you were extremely real," Grace said, "and that you were about the most unimpressed person I've ever met." "I was very impressed," Ruth said. "I was choosing to express it differently." Grace laughed. The sound of it, uncomplicated, genuine, still slightly surprised by itself. The laugh of someone rediscovering that laughter was possible. Moved through the satellite phone connection with a faint static overlay and arrived in Ruth's kitchen on the mountain where Ruth stood at the counter in the afternoon light, and it did something to the room. "I want you to come see him," Grace said. "When he's home, when we're settled. I want you to meet him properly, not the way it happened." "The way it happened was proper enough," Ruth said. "Come anyway," Grace said. Ruth looked out the window at the clearing, still marked by the faint impressions of 47 motorcycles slowly disappearing under the new snow that had fallen twice in the past week. The two does moved at the tree line. Jasper lay in the thin winter sun on the porch, his 3 legs arranged in the comfortable collapse he preferred for daytime resting. "All right," Ruth said. After she hung up, she stood with the phone in her hand for a moment and thought about the drive from the mountain to Knoxville. She hadn't been to Knoxville in 6 years. She had been to Coalfield 29 times since moving here, once a month on schedule. She had been to the veterinarian in Coalfield 4 times, including the trip with Jasper's leg. She had been to the county seat twice for property tax matters. She had not gone anywhere that was not strictly necessary. She put the phone down and went to the window and watched the does at the tree line for a while. On the 21st day after the storm, a different kind of knock came to her door. Not desperate, not threatening, the measured official knock of someone who had driven a government vehicle up her fire road and arrived with credentials and a prepared opening statement. 2 of them, both wearing suits that were wrong for the mountain cold. The kind of suits that said government procurement had been involved in their purchase. One was a woman in her late 30s, dark hair, sharp eyes. The other was a man in his mid-40s with a government-issue haircut and an expression of careful professional neutrality. They showed her their credentials, FBI Knoxville Field Office. The woman's name was Special Agent Deanna Pierce. The man was Special Agent Gregory Holden, not the Dr. Holden from the Iron Serpents, a different Holden, one she was going to have to try not to confuse. Mrs. McAllister, Agent Pierce said, we're here regarding the events of November 9th, specifically the incident involving a member of the Navarro Syndicate who was subsequently turned over to our Nashville field office by parties we're not at liberty to discuss. She paused. You were a witness. I was more than a witness, Ruth said. Come inside. She put the kettle on. She sat them at the kitchen table, the same table now clean where Grace had been on the night in question. She told them everything she had observed and done in precise chronological order, the way she had always written patient notes, time-stamped, factual, without embellishment or omission. She told them about the two men in the dark raincoats and the suppressed weapon and the threat on her porch. She told them about what the man in the raincoat had told Navarro's coordinator, that Grace was dead and Ruth had done it. She told them that she had no recording of these events, but could speak to them under oath and would do so. Agent Pierce wrote quickly. Agent Holden asked clarifying questions with the specific precision of someone building an evidentiary chain. They were good at their jobs, she could tell. When she finished, Agent Pierce put down her pen. Mrs. McAllister, I want to be direct with you. The Navarro organization is being prosecuted at the federal level. Your testimony as a first-hand witness to an attempted murder and a subsequent criminal conspiracy to misattribute that crime is significant. We're going to need you to testify. All right, Ruth said. Pierce looked at her. You understand what I said. This is a federal prosecution of a criminal organization. There may be safety implications. I understood the first time, Ruth said. When can I expect the subpoena? Pierce looked at Holden. Holden looked at Pierce. Neither of them said what they were clearly thinking, which Ruth assessed to be some variant of, this is not the reaction we were prepared for. Within the next 10 days, Pierce said. I'll need a week's notice for any court dates, Ruth said. I have a dog and I'll need arrangements made for his care. That can be accommodated, Pierce said. Ruth poured them both a cup of tea. They drank it. They drove back down the mountain in their government vehicle, and Ruth watched them go and then went back inside and called the number on the satellite phone. Wade answered on the second ring. The FBI came today, Ruth said. I know, he said. I have some visibility on that. They want me to testify. I know that too. A pause. The coin, Ruth said. You said it means I'm protected. Does that mean anything specific in this context, or is it more of a general statement? The pause from his end was longer than she had expected. It means, he said slowly, that from today until this trial is done, you will not be on this mountain alone, and that between now and the end of testimony, if anyone comes up that road without an invitation, they will have a conversation with our people before they get to your porch. Ruth considered this. I told you I don't need to be managed. I know. I meant it. I know you did, he said. I'm not talking about managing you. I'm talking about making sure the Navarros understand that what happened on November 9th didn't work, and that trying it again will cost them more than they can afford. That's a language they speak. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Outside, the late afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the snow on the clearing. A low winter angle turning everything golden and long-shadowed, the kind of light that lasted 15 minutes in November before the sun dropped behind the western ridge and left the mountain to the dark and the cold. All right, she said. The trial is probably 6 months out, Wade said. Possibly longer. Federal courts move slowly. I've been retired for 10 years, Ruth said. I have the time. He made the sound she had heard once before on the porch when she told him the deer were protected. The involuntary almost laugh of a man encountering something that required a category adjustment. Mrs. McAllister, he said. Ruth, she said. We've been through enough that I think you can call me Ruth. A pause. Ruth, he said. Grace wants me to ask you something. She already asked me. I said yes. Another pause longer. She told you what she wanted to ask? No, Ruth said, but I could guess. There was a quality to the silence from his end that she recognized by now. The recalibration silence. The moment when Wade Donovan was revising his understanding of something. She had learned to read it in the short time she had known him. We'll pick you up the weekend after Earl comes home, he said. If that suits. That suits, Ruth said. She hung up the phone and stood at the kitchen counter as the golden light faded outside and the mountain settled into its early dark. The wood stove ticked and popped with the particular domestic rhythm of a fire, well stoked and burning cleanly. Jasper came in from the porch and circled to his rug and settled with a sigh of such complete physical satisfaction that Ruth felt, unexpectedly, a smile form on her own face. An involuntary thing, not performed for anyone, just a simple mechanical response of a person who had seen something worth smiling at. She picked up Earl's book from the side table. The gas station receipt still marked his place somewhere in the middle, 9 years old and still legible. She opened to the first page instead of his page. She had never read it from the beginning. She sat down in his chair and began. Winter moved through the Cumberland Highlands the way it always did. Not with the dramatic finality of storms, but with a slow, authoritative deepening, the temperature dropping degree by degree over weeks, until the creek below the east ridge was locked solid, and the deer left tracks in the snow at the clearing's edge every morning that were still crisp at noon, because nothing had warmed enough to soften them. Ruth ran her mornings the same way she had always run them. Coffee before light, the stove fed before coffee. Jasper out for his morning circuit of the clearing, his three-legged lope having achieved, over years, a practical efficiency that was almost beautiful in its adaptation. She watched him from the porch with her cup, thinking nothing in particular, which was different from thinking nothing. It was a specific kind of active quiet that she had taken years to develop, and that she valued above most other things she possessed. The difference now was what she noticed at the lower bend of the fire road. On most mornings, not every morning, the schedule was deliberately irregular. There was a truck parked in the wide shoulder below the first switchback, sometimes a bike instead. She could just see it from the high porch in the early morning light, a dark shape at the edge of her visible range. She never went to investigate or acknowledge it. Neither did it come to her. It was there, that was all. The presence was the point. She had been surprised to find that she was sleeping better. She had attributed poor sleep for years to the accumulated physiological indignities of age, the joints that ached at 3 in the morning, the pattern of light sleep and early waking that she had understood to be simply what getting older felt like. Now she slept heavily and woke late, her body apparently having reached some decision about safety that her conscious mind had not been consulted on. She found this mildly annoying and quietly valuable. In December, Knoxville, the drive down the mountain, through the counties, the highway widening and the traffic thickening as she came into the city's gravitational pull. She had forgotten how cities sounded, the layered ambient noise of them, the way every surface reflected and multiplied the sounds of every other surface until you were inside something constructed entirely of audio incident. She drove through it feeling alert in the sharp way that the unfamiliar produced. Wade had sent an address, a neighborhood she didn't know in East Knoxville, the kind of residential block that had been working class 50 years ago and had settled into a comfortable, maintained middle age. The house was a white clapboard 2-story with a covered porch and a flagpole in the yard, flying the American flag, and below it, a smaller flag she didn't recognize. Dark green with the iron serpent's emblem, she understood after a moment. Grace met her at the door. She had color back. Her shoulder was in a sling still, the surgical repair healing through its stages, but she moved with the recovered energy of a young woman whose body had decided to put the crisis behind it. She was holding the baby. Earl was 6 pounds 2 ounces by this point, home from the NICU for 11 days, still small but done with the translucent fragility of the very premature, and settled into the specific solid self-possession of a baby who has decided to remain in the world and is proceeding on that basis. He had Ruth's blue plaid blanket, she noticed. They had kept it or gotten a replacement in the same pattern. He recognized the blanket, Grace said, watching Ruth's face. I know it sounds crazy, but he calmed down the first time we put it on him. It doesn't sound crazy, Ruth said. She held him for a long time, standing in the foyer while Grace talked about the NICU nurses and the neonatologist's final assessment and the feeding schedule they were working on. The baby regarded Ruth with the unfocused but somehow comprehensive attention of very young infants, the quality of looking that preceded recognition and yet seemed, impossibly, to contain it. His eyes were going to be blue. She could see the color settling in. Wade came in from the back of the house, moving through the hallway with the economy of motion of someone who had learned to navigate tight spaces as a large person for long enough that it had become natural. He stopped when he saw Ruth with the baby, and his face went through the unguarded transition she had seen before. The brief, involuntary opening before the management reasserted itself. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for asking," Ruth said. She handed the baby back to Grace, who received him with the practiced confidence of a woman 3 weeks into motherhood and finding her footing in it. "He's doing well." "He is." A pause. "Can I show you something?" She followed him through the house to the back, into a kitchen that was large and well organized and smelled of something slow cooking. Through the back window, the rear yard was a wide rectangle of cleared land with a covered structure at the far end. A shop or a garage, its doors open, light spilling out. "Boone's people have been working on something," Wade said. She didn't ask what. She followed him across the yard and into the covered structure, and inside was a motorcycle. Not one she recognized by make, though it was clearly custom. The lines were specific in a way that spoke of individual construction, every element chosen rather than standard issued. It was painted in a particular dark gray with a silver undertone that caught the shop light differently at different angles. It sat on the stand with the patient, balanced posture of something built to be exactly what it was. "I don't ride," Ruth said. "I know." Wade looked at the bike and then at her. "It's not for riding. Not primarily." He nodded at the back of the gas tank. There was a panel there fitted with a small recessed handle. He reached down and opened it to reveal a shallow interior compartment, just large enough to contain, she looked closer, a satellite communicator and a flat panel screen, and what appeared to be a compact radio transceiver. "Short-range base station," Wade said. "Encrypted. It can reach any of our people within 40 miles, and through relay can reach the main charter in Knoxville. It runs off the bike's battery or off a standard outlet." He paused. "You can put it anywhere in the cabin. Doesn't have to be on the bike. But Boone thought it should be on the bike because—" He stopped. "Because that way I know who it came from," Ruth said. "Because that way it doesn't look like a medical alert button," Wade said. "And because you're not a person who should have a medical alert button." Ruth looked at the motorcycle, the gray of it, the silver undertone. She thought of her truck, which was also gray, which she had chosen because gray was practical and didn't show road dirt, and Earl had said it made her look like a government contractor. "The communication system," she said. "When I use it, what does that do on your end?" "Sounds a tone on the duty phone and gives a location," Wade said. "Someone calls back within 3 minutes. If there's no call back within 5, they're on their way to your coordinates." "What's the radius of the relay system?" "In clear conditions, 40 miles easily. In the mountains, line of sight is the limiting factor, but we have repeaters on 3 of the high points on the plateau. From your cabin, you should have good coverage." Ruth was quiet for a moment. She walked around the motorcycle slowly, the way she walked around things she was assessing, taking in all sides before reaching a conclusion. The workmanship was evident. Someone had spent considerable time on this. "Boone built it?" she asked. "Boone designed it. 4 of his people built it. Took them 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Since mid-November, since the night of the storm. They had started this the week after." She stood at the front of the bike and looked at the handlebars. The grips worn to a comfortable ergonomic finish, the throttle and brake positioned with intuitive logic. "I said I don't ride," she said. "I know." "But Earl did," she said. 30 years ago, before his knees, he had a Triumph. She had not thought about the Triumph in years. Earl had sold it the year Karen was born, more out of Grace's father practicality than actual desire, and had mentioned it maybe 3 times in the decades after, always with the specific wistfulness of someone who had given up something they were not fully done with. She put her hand on the left grip. The leather was warm from the shop heat. "I'm not going to learn to ride at 74, she said. "No," Wade agreed. "But I'll put it in the barn," she said, "and I'll keep the communication system charged." She felt him looking at her. "That's all I'm agreeing to," she said. "That's all I'm asking," he said. They went back inside. Grace had put the baby down for a nap in the portable crib in the living room and was in the kitchen making coffee with the methodical attention of someone who was still learning to do things one-handed. Ruth sat at the kitchen table, a different kitchen table than the one that had seen the worst of the night, but a kitchen table, and watched Grace manage. I have to testify in March, Ruth said. The FBI contacted me again last week. The federal prosecution is moving faster than they expected. Grace set a cup in front of her. I know, Wade told me. She sat down across from Ruth, her left hand cradling the coffee cup, her right arm in its sling. I'm testifying too. Ruth looked at her. Primary victim testimony, Grace said. First day of trial. My lawyer says it's the strongest part of the prosecution's case. A pause. I want to do it. I know it's... She stopped, considered. I know it's complicated given our position. But what they did to the baby, what they tried to do... She stopped again. Her jaw was set. She had, Ruth noted, a very strong jaw. She had not noticed it at the time, being otherwise occupied, but it was evident now. It needs to be said in a room where it becomes permanent record, Grace said. Yes, Ruth said, it does. They drank their coffee. The baby made a small sound from the living room and then was quiet again. Outside the kitchen window, two iron serpents were doing something purposeful with equipment in the rear yard, but quietly, without fanfare. I want to ask you something, Grace said, and you can say no. Ruth waited. After the trial, after this is all done. Grace looked at her coffee cup and then up at Ruth. Would you consider coming down more often? Not for anything in particular. Not to watch Earl or manage anything. Just to... She stopped. I didn't grow up with grandmothers, she said. Mine were gone before I was old enough to know them. And Earl is going to need people who can show him things I can't show him. Ruth was quiet. I know you have your life on the mountain, Grace said. I know that's not something you... Grace, Ruth said. Grace stopped. Yes, Ruth said. I'll come down. The trial had been scheduled for the second week of March. It was held in Knoxville in the federal courthouse on Main Street, a building Ruth had driven past many times in her years at Vanderbilt without ever entering. She entered it now in her good wool coat, the dark blue one she had bought for Earl's funeral and then worn to nothing after, her testimony notes in a manila folder in her left hand, and she sat in the witness room and waited to be called. She had testified before, depositions mostly, the routine evidentiary maintenance that emergency nursing generated over a long career. She was comfortable with the format, the structured question and the structured answer, the discipline of staying within the boundaries of what you actually witnessed rather than what you inferred or felt. She was good at the discipline. She had always been good at the discipline. When they called her, she walked to the stand and was sworn in and sat down and looked at the courtroom. Grace was in the gallery, 3 rows back, with her mother, a compact woman in her late 50s with Grace's cheekbones in the particular composed stillness of a woman who had been through difficult things and was here now in support of someone she loved, going through another one. Wade was at the end of the same row. He had managed the remarkable sartorial feat of looking like a respectable citizen in a dark suit while somehow remaining completely and unmistakably himself. Boone was beside him, fractionally less successful at the sartorial management, but trying visibly. Agents Pierce and Holden were at the prosecution table. At the defense table, 4 members of the Navarro organization's regional leadership sat in expensive suits with expensive lawyers, and Ruth looked at each of them in turn before she looked away. The man who had stood on her porch with the tactical flashlight was not among them. He had accepted a plea in exchange for his cooperation, which Ruth understood to be the pragmatic outcome she had anticipated when she told Wade to put him on the official record. Ruth testified for 2 hours. She told the jury what she had seen on the night of November 9th in precise, unemotional terms. She described the wound, the blood loss, the interventions, the 2 men who came to the cabin door, the weapon she had seen on the armed man. She described the threat. She described what the man with the flashlight had subsequently told his principals, as relayed to her by the subject himself in the presence of witnesses, which the prosecution had carefully structured as an admissible recitation. She described the baby. That was the part that the lawyers on both sides had clearly anticipated, because the prosecution asked for it specifically, and the defense objected to it specifically, and the judge allowed it, and the jury listened to it with the particular quality of attention that people brought to things that moved them without their entirely intending to be moved. She said a premature child, born under circumstances that should have made his survival unlikely, who had weighed 4 pounds 3 ounces at his last measurement in the NICU, and who was, at the time of this testimony, at home with his family and in good health. She said his name is Earl. She did not know, afterward, Why that part had been difficult to say. It was a fact. She was testifying to facts. But the room had been very quiet when she said the name, and something in the air of the courtroom had changed, and she had felt it change, and she had disciplined herself to stillness the same way she had disciplined herself to stillness all her life, and delivered the rest of her testimony cleanly. When she was dismissed, she walked back through the gallery, and Grace reached out as she passed and touched her arm. Just a touch, brief, specific. And Ruth put her own hand over Grace's for one moment, and then kept walking. The verdict came on a Thursday in April. Ruth heard about it from Wade, who called the satellite phone at 4:17 in the afternoon while she was stacking the spring firewood she had cut the previous weekend. All four defendants were convicted on the primary charges: conspiracy to commit murder, interstate criminal enterprise, weapons violations. The sentencing was scheduled for June. She stood in the yard with the phone to her ear and the pile of split hickory at her feet, and the early April light warm and clear across the clearing, where no snow remained, and the ground was beginning to show green at the edges. "How's Grace?" she said. "Good," he said. "She's—" a pause. "She cried is what she did. I'm not supposed to tell you that." "I won't tell anyone," Ruth said. "Earl pulled himself to standing this morning," Wade said, using the coffee table. "He's been working up to it for 2 weeks. Grace has a video." "She should send it," Ruth said. "I'll tell her." A pause. "Ruth." "Yes. Thank you," he said, "for testifying, for doing it the right way, the way you said to. I know it wasn't—" He stopped, started again. "It wasn't easy. Being in that room, going through all of it again, I know that." Ruth looked at the cleared mountain, the pale new green, the sky above the eastern ridge, the particular clear blue of April in Tennessee. She thought about the jury in the courtroom and the names said in a quiet room. She thought about the night of November 9th, the way it had been contained in a single long darkness, and had somehow, from that compression, produced every subsequent day. "It was the right way," she said. "That matters more than easy." The summer was the best one she could remember in a long time, which surprised her because she had stopped expecting summers to be particularly different from one another. She drove to Knoxville 6 times between June and September, sometimes for specific reasons. Earl's 4-month checkup, a Sunday dinner Grace had been planning with methodical enthusiasm for weeks, a community event at the Iron Serpent's Knoxville chapter hall that Wade had casually mentioned and that she had gone to out of curiosity and had found, to her genuine surprise, to be an entirely ordinary and cheerful collection of people eating barbecue and arguing about baseball. Sometimes for no reason specifically, just to go. She met Boone properly on the 3rd visit at the chapter hall over the barbecue and the baseball argument. He was more voluble than he appeared, the scarred exterior and the vice president's gravity concealing a man with a dry, deliberate humor that emerged in short bursts and was funnier for its economy. He had served in the Army for 8 years, she discovered, 2 tours in a period that overlapped not at all with hers, but that shared certain atmospheric characteristics. The same quality of institutional management of violence, the same structure of unit loyalty, the same precise understanding of what people would do for each other under the right conditions. They talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with any of it: the mechanics of the custom bike he'd built, a book she'd been reading, the particular qualities of Cumberland mountain hardwood versus the oak he'd grown up working with in West Virginia. He was good company in the way that people who had been through things were good company, not requiring the constant maintenance of pleasant surface, comfortable with silence, interested in the actual content of a conversation rather than its performance. On the drive home that night, up through the familiar counties and the mountain roads and the final fire road to the cabin, Ruth noticed something she had been noticing by degrees all summer and had not fully articulated until that particular drive. She was not retreating, she was returning. It was a different thing. The cabin was the same cabin. The mountain was the same mountain. Earl's chair was where it had always been, and the 2 cups of coffee were still a morning habit that she had not broken because she was not sure she wanted to. But the quality of the return had shifted, from withdrawal into depth to the completion of a circuit, the movement back to a center that was itself in motion, connected now to other things. She was not sure when exactly the change had happened. Possibly November, possibly over the long subsequent months of regular contact and regular supply runs and 6 weeks of winter testimony preparation and 2 hours of barbecue and baseball with Boone Keller. Possibly when a woman named Grace had pressed her lips to a baby's head in amber lamplight and wept without shame, and the weeping had moved through the cabin and found something that Ruth had thought was sealed. She parked the truck and walked to the porch, and Jasper met her at the steps, three-legged and vigorous and entirely satisfied with the hour and the night and her presence in it. She sat on the top step and he sat beside her, and she put her hand on his head and they watched the dark clearing together. Above the eastern ridgeline, the stars were extraordinary in the clear September air. The full late summer catalog of them, the Milky Way, a smear of pale light from northeast to southwest. Everything else in specific brilliant isolation. She could hear the creek below the ridge, released from its winter silence, moving with the particular busyness of fall water over stone. She put her hand in her coat pocket. The coin was there. It was always there now, moved from the apron to the coat pocket to whatever she was wearing, a habit formed without deliberation. The heft of it was familiar. She thought about Earl, not with the contained, disciplined grief that had characterized the 8 years since his death, the sealed quality of it, the grief managed into a shape that did not intrude on the continuation of days. She thought about him the way she had thought about him before that grief, in the years when he was living, with something complicated and warm and specific, a full person in her mind rather than an absence she was working around. She thought about the gas station receipt in the book. She had never removed it from the page where he had left it. She had read the book from his beginning point to the end and then set it back on the side table. The receipt was still there. She would let it stay. The morning after she got home, on a Wednesday in the second week of September, she drove down the fire road to the lower switchback where the truck was usually parked. A different truck this week, she didn't recognize the make, and she stopped and got out and walked to the driver's side window. The man inside was young, mid-20s, iron serpent's patch, a paperback open against the steering wheel. He looked at her with the specific, surprised expression of someone whose routine has been interrupted in an unexpected direction. Ruth had brought 2 cups of coffee in a thermos. She poured them both. "I don't know your name," she said. He told her, "Jesse Blackwood, from the Morristown chapter." "How long are you on this rotation?" she asked. "2 weeks," when he said. "Then Carver's people take it." She handed him the cup. He took it with the particular careful formality of a young man who had been raised to be respectful to older women and was uncertain about the protocol for the specific situation. "What are you reading?" she asked. He showed her. A used paperback Western. Different author than hers, same genre. She raised an eyebrow. "Wade said you read Westerns," Jesse said, slightly defensive. "Wade knows what I read?" Grace told him. A pause. "She tells him things about you." Ruth considered this. She looked at the cover of the paperback. Then she reached into her coat pocket and produced her own copy. She had taken to carrying one since the summer began, the habit of a reader who did not trust that there would always be waiting time without a book. "Have you read this one?" she asked. He had not. "Then when you're done with yours," Ruth said, "I'll leave this one on the porch." She finished her coffee. She drove back up the mountain. She put the other cup in the sink. She sat in Earl's chair and opened her book and read until the light changed. And then she put more wood on the fire and made supper. And the day completed itself in the ordinary manner of days that were, she had decided, exactly what they needed to be. The winter came again with the reliable certainty of seasons. The first snow was in November, the anniversary of the storm, and Ruth noted the date without ceremony. She was not a person who made ceremonies out of anniversaries, but she noted it. She was on the porch with her coffee when the first flakes came. Jasper in his usual morning position on the step below her, both of them watching the clearing in the quiet before full light. Earl was walking by December. Not steadily. The particular aggressive, staggering lurch of a 1-year-old who had determined that bipedal locomotion was the correct approach and was committed to the implementation regardless of outcomes. But walking, which Grace reported with the specific gleeful outrage of a mother who had thought she was ready for this development and had discovered she was not ready for this development. Ruth drove down for his birthday. She brought Jasper, who had the encounter with Earl that dogs and babies always had with each other. The mutual investigation of a boundary-free meeting between 2 creatures who operated primarily on instinct and enthusiasm and had no use for social performance. Jasper was patient. Earl was thorough. Both of them were satisfied with the result. Grace took a photograph. In it, Ruth was sitting on the living room floor with Jasper beside her and Earl in her lap, both of her hands around the baby to keep him from pitching forward in his current preferred manner of locomotion. And she was looking down at him, and her face was open in the way that faces were when they did not know they were being photographed. Not performing anything, not managing anything. Just there. Grace sent her the photograph the next day, printed and framed, with a note that said only, "For the cabin." Ruth put it on the mantelpiece, next to the kerosene lamp she had not replaced with electric because she preferred the quality of its light. On the first clear morning of the new year, with frost on the clearing and the creek locked again, and the two does at the tree line leaving their careful tracks in the new snow, Ruth McAllister drank her coffee on the porch and let the morning be what it was. The coin was in her pocket, the photograph was on the mantelpiece, the satellite phone was charged on the counter. The motorcycle was in the barn with its communications panel lit green, indicating signal, indicating reach, indicating that 40 miles in every direction there were people who would hear her if she needed to be heard. She did not think she would need to be heard. She had been managing this mountain alone for 11 years, and she was very good at it. But the green light meant something. She had decided over the months that it meant the same thing as the truck at the lower switchback and the firewood and the 8-year-old bourbon that Boone had left on her porch at Christmas with a note that said only, "Good winter." It meant background presence. It meant the world knowing where you were. She had built her life on the mountain on the principle of needing nothing from anyone. She still believed in the principle. She had simply revised her understanding of what needing meant. Needing was different from accepting. Needing was the desperation of dependency, the collapse of self-sufficiency into reliance, the trade of capability for comfort that she had watched hollow out people she had cared about over the years. She had worked too long and too hard to be capable to surrender that capability. But accepting was what you did when something was offered freely, without debt or transaction, by people who understood that what they were offering was not replacement, but addition. When people added themselves to your world without requiring you to diminish yours. She had not been good at that before November. She was learning. Jasper came and sat beside her on the step. She gave him a piece of the biscuit she had made for breakfast. He received it with his customary dignity, as though accepting tribute, and they watched the does move through the snow at the tree line with the unhurried certainty of animals who owned the mountain they were on. Below the first switchback, visible in the long horizontal light of the early morning, the dark shape of a truck parked in the wide shoulder. Present, quiet, doing nothing except being there. Ruth finished her coffee. She went inside and made the second cup and set it on the counter and stood for a moment looking at it. Then she picked it up, walked back to the door, opened it, and stood on the porch holding both cups. The morning was very cold and very clear. The kind of morning that the mountains made in January without apology or sentiment, simply because that was what they did. They made this in the winter, in the early dark before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, and they had been making it for longer than anyone had been alive to see it, and they would make it again tomorrow and the day after. She stood there in the cold with both cups, feeling the warmth of them, watching the light change on the snow. After a while, she went back inside. She sat in Earl's chair. She opened the book to the page where his receipt still marked the place. She looked at it for a moment. The receipt, the specific paper of it, 9 years old, the handwriting on the back where Earl had written something she had never been able to fully make out. Something that looked like a phone number or a measurement or possibly a reminder about something mundane and gone. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket next to the coin. She turned the page. The fire burned steadily. Outside, the mountain was doing what mountains did. And Ruth McAllister, 74 years old, widow, veteran, 31-year nurse, solitary resident of a fire road cabin in the Cumberland Highlands, who had delivered a baby in a storm and stood on her own porch with a gun and testified in federal court and learned in the last year of her life's longest chapter that the end of a chapter was not the same thing as an ending. Ruth McAllister read, "That January became February, and February became the particular transitional uncertainty of March in the mountains. Not winter, not spring, the two seasons arguing across the ridgeline in alternating cold fronts and warm days that could not make up their mind. Ruth knew March well. She had always found it the most honest month, unwilling to pretend it was something it wasn't, wearing its ambivalence openly. She found herself thinking in ways she had not thought in years. Not about the past, which had been her primary mental territory for the last 8 years, but forward. Small forward thoughts, the kind you entertain when the future felt like something you were moving toward rather than something you were waiting in. Grace had mentioned once that the Iron Serpents had a scholarship fund for the children of members who wanted college education. She had mentioned it without agenda, just in passing, in the context of a conversation about Earl's early testing results at the 6-month assessment, strong cognitive markers, the pediatrician had noted, which Grace had reported with a specific careful modesty that barely concealed her complete lack of surprise. Ruth had said, "If you want, I can help him with that, with the studying, when he's old enough." I taught at Vanderbilt for 5 years between my second and third decades in the ER, a visiting adjunct role that she had found unexpectedly rewarding and had given up because the ER pulled harder. Grace had said, "I was hoping you'd say that." They had not made it official. It was not the kind of thing you made official. It was just a conversation, the same way that most real commitments were just conversations, said once plainly by two people who meant it without ceremony or contract. In March, the sentencing. Ruth had not attended the sentencing, which was a different kind of courthouse appearance than testimony. She had done her part, and she understood the mechanics of legal closure well enough to know that the sentencing was the prosecution's business, not the witnesses. But Wade had called her afterward at 4:40 in the afternoon and told her the numbers. 3 of the 4 defendants received the maximum federal sentences available on the primary charges. The 4th had accepted a cooperation agreement and received a reduced sentence that the prosecution had accepted as the price of the information he provided on the Navarro network's broader structure. The Navarro organization in the Cumberland corridor had, by the time the spring arrived, ceased to exist in any practical operational sense. The prosecution had been the public face of the dismantling. The other part, the part Wade had mentioned once and not elaborated on, and Ruth had not asked him to elaborate on, had happened in the months between November and the trial quietly, in ways that did not produce news coverage. She had known it was happening. She had not asked for details. She had found over the months that this was the right relationship to have with the information, aware of its existence, uninvolved in its specifics. The same relationship she had to the truck at the lower switchback and the firewood and the encrypted communications panel. She knew the shape of the protection. She did not need to know all its edges. What she needed to know, she knew. Earl was walking, Grace was healed, the mountain was intact. The 2 does were at the tree line every morning, and she had been watching them for 4 years now, and she expected to watch them for more. On a Saturday in late March, with the first real warmth of the year moving in from the southwest, and the snow at the edges of the clearing pulling back from the dead grass beneath it, with the reluctant slowness of things that have stayed too long, Boone Keller drove up the fire road in a truck with the Iron Serpent's emblem on the side and knocked on the cabin door. He had 2 things with him. One was a chainsaw, new, properly calibrated, a better model than the one she had been using for 4 years. He explained with the pragmatic brevity she had come to expect from him that her current chainsaw had a tension issue in the bar mount that was going to cause it to kick in the next heavy use session, which was a risk he was not willing to leave unaddressed. She thanked him and did not argue. The other thing was a letter. He gave it to her without explanation, which was also consistent with his communication style. It was from Agent Deanna Pierce, FBI Knoxville. Typed on official letterhead, professional in tone, the specific formality of government correspondence. It said in the careful language of such documents that her cooperation with the investigation and prosecution had contributed materially to the successful outcome of a significant federal case. It said that the Bureau was grateful for her willingness to testify under circumstances that she had described as creating some personal risk. It said in the final paragraph, in language that had clearly been added by someone who understood that the official language of the preceding paragraphs was insufficient to what was being communicated. What you did on the night of November 9th and what you did in the months following was extraordinary. You deserve to know that it mattered. Ruth read the letter twice. She set it on the kitchen table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went to the shelf above the stove, where she kept the things she wanted to keep. The narrow shelf where Jasper's veterinary records and her own medical paperwork and Earl's Vanderbilt YD badge that she had kept without knowing exactly why were arranged in the particular order of things that had been there long enough to acquire permanence. She added the letter to the end of the row, standing upright against the back wall. Boone was outside. She could hear him assessing the firewood situation with the focused attention he brought to physical tasks. She poured 2 cups of coffee and took them both out to the porch. He looked at the cup she offered him with the same careful formality that Jesse Blackwood had shown in December. She was beginning to understand that this was not Iron Serpent's protocol, but something more personal. The specific courtesy of men who had not been raised to accept things from older women without a moment's calibration and were doing the calibration visibly, which she found more honest than men who pretended the calibration wasn't happening. "Thank you," he said. They stood on the porch with their cups and looked at the clearing where the snow was retreating and the first wet green of the year was coming in underneath. "The chainsaw," Ruth said. "You could have sent it up with Jesse." "I could have," Boone agreed. She waited. "Wanted to see the place," he said. "You talk about it enough. Down in Knoxville." She looked at him. "I talk about the mountain?" "You mention it," he said. "Things you're watching, the deer, the creek, the light in the morning." A pause. "It sounds like the place looks." Ruth looked out at the clearing, trying to see it for a moment, the way someone would see it who had been hearing it described and was seeing it for the first time. The long, cold beauty of it, the pines and the cleared center and the eastern ridgeline, and the quality of sky that you only got at elevation, that specific blue that was deeper and further than low country blue, as though you could see farther into the atmosphere from up here. She supposed she did talk about it. She had not realized she was doing it. But she had been talking to these people regularly for 4 months, in Knoxville and on the phone, and apparently at some point she had started to offer her mountain to them the way you offered things you valued to people you had come to regard as worth the offering. "It's a good place," she said, which was the most she had ever said about it in a single sentence. "It is," Boone agreed. They finished their coffee. He worked on the firewood for an hour, and she worked on the winter accounting she had been putting off since January, sitting at the kitchen table with her reading glasses and her old calculator. And the sound of the splitting maul outside was a comfortable domestic background, the sound of someone else's productive presence in her space, which she had not experienced in 8 years and which she was, she noticed, not finding intrusive. When he was done, he stacked the split wood in the covered side of the lean-to and came back to the porch. "Jesse says you left him a book," he said. "He left it on my porch when he was done with his rotation," Ruth said. "I'm surprised he didn't keep it. He said he'd read it 3 times and didn't want to own it more than that." A pause. "He also said you make the best coffee he's had outside his grandmother's house." Ruth did not permit herself to smile at this. Boone said, "My rotation comes up in 2 weeks. I'll take the lower switchback." She looked at him. "If that's all right," he said. She looked at the clearing. The green was coming in around the edges now, pulling the season toward itself with the patient insistence of growing things that had been waiting out the cold under the snow all winter, unhurried, certain of their own arrival. "Bring your own book," she said. He nodded. He drove down the fire road, and the sound of his truck engine faded through the switchbacks, and then was gone. And the mountain was its own sound again. The creek and the pines and the particular speaking quality of a high place on a warming day. The snow melting at the edges of the clearing with a soft, intermittent dripping from the eaves of the lean-to. Jasper came and sat beside her on the steps. She put her hand on his head. In the barn, the gray motorcycle sat on its stand with the communications panel lit green. On the mantelpiece, the photograph from Earl's birthday. On the shelf above the stove, the letter and Earl's Vanderbilt ID badge. In her coat pocket, the coin and the folded gas station receipt. The mountain endured. That was what mountains did. They endured, and in their enduring, they made space for everything that happened on them. The storms and the quiet, the arrivals and the departures, the long solitude and the sudden, unexpected fullness of a single November night that had revised the terms of everything that followed. Ruth McAllister had moved to this mountain to find peace. She had found it. It had turned out to be a more complicated peace than the one she had been looking for. Less like absence and more like presence. Less like stillness and more like the stillness inside motion, the center point of a life still turning. She sat on the porch in the March warmth and let it be what it was. Behind her, in the cabin, the fire burned steadily. Ahead of her, the mountain was doing what mountains did in the first warmth of the returning year. It was waking up. So was she. April came fully. The 2 does brought a 3rd deer to the tree line, a yearling, leggy and uncertain, watching the clearing with the vigilant attention of the newly arrived. Ruth noticed it on the first morning it appeared and made a note of it in the same mental inventory she kept of the mountain's seasonal changes, the small, reliable archive of her years up here. She drove to Knoxville twice in April. The second time she brought a casserole, which she had not told anyone she was bringing, and which Grace received with an expression of pure, unguarded pleasure that Ruth found disproportionate to the gift, until she remembered that this was the first time she had offered something in the domestic register, had arrived at the house not empty-handed, but with the particular offering of a person who had cooked something for you, which carried meaning beyond the food itself. Earl had recently become fascinated by Jasper. This was a new development. He had met Jasper at the birthday and had been interested, but now, at 13 months, he had opinions. His opinion about Jasper was that Jasper was the best and most important thing in any room and should be made available at all times. Jasper bore this with the philosophical patience of a dog who had learned in 7 years that enthusiasm in others was usually benign. Ruth sat on the floor with both of them and watched Earl navigate the terrain between Jasper and the coffee table with the focused, strategic intensity of someone solving a problem they had recently decided was worth solving. "He's going to be walking everywhere in a month," Grace said from the kitchen doorway. "He's already walking everywhere," Ruth said. "He's just working on the software." Grace laughed. From the back of the house, Wade's voice, and then Boone's, in the specific register of men talking about something that required no resolution, the comfortable back and forth of people who had been talking this way for years and no longer needed to manage the interaction. She could hear Wade's dry pause before a punchline and Boone's abbreviated response, and then both of them, briefly, in the relaxed amusement of people who found each other reliably funny. She could hear it from where she was on the floor with the baby and the dog, and she registered it as she registered all the peripheral sounds of this house, the familiar texture of a place that was not hers, but that she was becoming familiar with, the way you became familiar with a landscape you visited regularly, learning its permanent features and its seasonal changes, the sounds it made at different times of day. She was learning these people. She was letting them learn her. These were related processes, and they were not fast, but they were underway. Earl grabbed Jasper's ear, and Jasper turned his head and looked at Ruth with an expression that communicated clearly. "I am tolerating this." She told him with her hand that he was doing very well. On the mantelpiece here, Wade and Grace's wedding photograph, taken outdoors, both of them squinting slightly against the sun, Grace in a simple white dress and Wade in a dark suit that he wore with the same slightly effortful dignity that he'd worn to the trial. Both of them with the particular expression of people who are performing a ceremony while simultaneously finding the performance secondary to the fact. The fact was legible in how they stood toward each other, the involuntary orientation of two people who had been organizing themselves around each other for long enough that they did it without thinking. Ruth noted the photograph and what it contained and set it alongside the other things she had been assembling in the mental inventory she kept of this family. Because that was what they were. Not a complicated thing, not a qualified thing. She had been working up to the word for months, and now in the April afternoon in the East Knoxville living room, with a baby pulling her dog's ear, she arrived at it cleanly. Family. The word that named the thing that had no formal basis or legal structure, but had the weight of the real, the organic, the grown from necessity kind. She had a daughter in Phoenix who called monthly. She had a family in Knoxville who had emerged from a single November night and had been growing since. She was 74 years old and she was still surprised. She had not expected to be surprised anymore. She was glad to be wrong. The drive home was through the evening. Longer shadows, the day's warmth retreating, the highway giving way to the state road, giving way to the county road, giving way to the mountain road, and finally the fire road, the familiar sequence of diminishing traffic and increasing altitude that she had driven 50-some times in the years up here, each time arriving at the same destination, but not always arriving from the same place. She parked the truck and sat in it for a moment with the engine off and the windows down, listening to the mountain at dusk. The specific conversation of it, the birds and the water and the wind in the high canopy, the comprehensive sensory presence of a living wild place at the threshold between day and dark. Jasper was in the back seat making his preparatory noises about exiting the vehicle. She opened her door. The green light was on in the barn. The photograph was on the mantelpiece. The receipt was in her pocket. Ruth went inside and built up the fire and made her supper and sat in Earl's chair and read until she was tired, and when she was tired, she went to bed and she slept. Outside, the mountain did what it did. The creek ran. The pines moved in the night wind. The stars moved across the gap of sky visible between the ridgelines. The same stars that had been moving there before anyone lived on this mountain, and that would be moving thereafter. And in the morning, as always, the light came over the eastern ridge. Ruth was already on the porch.